things that are now lost. We Sherristones have always been the archivists of the North. This seemed to astonish both the Starks, who swapped one of those odd, intense, looks again. What was it they were hiding? So this is a history of the first men. The Starks stared at the book, as did Tyrion. Oh, he had to read that. Jaime. He had to face facts. It was hard to admit this, as it flew in the face of years of silent contempt and quiet japes. But it had to be done. Robert Baratheon was starting to worry him. The Fat King was sparring with Selmy at the moment, the first with Stormbreaker and the second with his own beloved sword. He could tell that Selmy wasn't quite giving it his all, but then neither was he letting the Fat King up easy. Selmy was still as brilliant as ever, more than Jaime liked to admit. But Baratheon, well, he never made the same mistake twice. His normal weapon was the Warhammer, a devastating weapon in its own right, but a different one from Stormbreaker. It needed a different grip, a different stance, a different way of controlling the impetus. And Baratheon was absorbing every lesson and learning. Selmy won the bout, but only just, and as the two men leant, panting, on their swords, he explained to Baratheon just what exactly it was that he had done wrong in a low voice. The Fat King listened carefully, absorbing every word with a frown of concentration, his feet moving slightly as he seemed to relive what he had done and what he had done wrong. Jaime sighed slightly and then looked over his shoulder to the north. He wondered idly what young Dane was doing now and what he had done in that godswood that didn't even contain a weirwood tree. Word had it that he had left it pale and trembling. That said, word also had it that Petyr Baelish had faked his own death, that Robert Baratheon was the bastard son of Aerys Targaryen, and that it was possible to balance an egg on its end on the equinox. Frankly, you couldn't really trust the word on the street at times. Selmy, you look done in, Baratheon panted finally, before stretching and hefting that big damn sword of his. And don't deny that you have a cold. I can hear you sniffling. Sir Barristan smiled slightly. I may not be entirely at my best, I must admit, your grace. But you asked me to teach you, and teach you I shall. But not at the expense of you falling over. Kingslayer. Can you take over from Sir Barristan? He smirked slightly as he stood. But of course, your grace. I shall endeavor to complete your education with the sword. Sir Barristan, where shall I start? Footwork, Sir Jaime. His grace needs to work on his footwork. And also his swing, but you know my mantra. The smirk grew a little. Place your feet right and you can slay giants. Very well, your grace. The Fat King worked his shoulders up and down for a long moment and then sent a tight grin his way. Very well then, Kingslayer. Let's see what you're made of then. More than you are, Fatso, Jaime thought with a smirk, before drawing his sword and stepping forwards. There was a moment of silence and then he started to watch the king's eyes. The key to any fight, even a mere sparring match like this, with both men pulling their strokes before any actual damage could be done, was the eyes. You watched the eyes of your opponent. They gave away the moment before they played a stroke. He watched those blue eyes carefully. They were narrowed already, studying him back. And then Baratheon showed that he was truly formidable, because his eyes didn't even flicker as he swung Stormbreaker. Jaime parried it with an internal curse. The bloody man knew all about that, I think. Had probably used that against him. Another parry, one that staggered him slightly, and then he swung against his king, forcing him back a step. There was a slightly feral grin on the face of Baratheon now, one that scared him just a little bit. The swords clashed again and he felt a frown steal over his face. His sword sounded wrong all of a sudden, as if it was balanced wrongly, which was insane. He could tell by the way that Sir Barristan had looked up suddenly to one side that he too had heard that discordant note of steel against whatever the Seven Hells Stormbreaker was made from. Baratheon swung again, a blow over his shoulder, and he swung his own sword up to meet it, and then the world twisted and turned around his head. As the two swords met, Stormbreaker seemed to boom almost, and his own sword shattered like a piece of mirrorish glass. Shards flew everywhere and one brushed his cheek, leaving first a cold feeling and then burning pain. Both men staggered as their impetus took them away from each other, but Baratheon controlled his rush in time whilst Jaime did not. One of his feet seemed to get tangled with the other, and to his humiliation he ended up sprawled on the floor, still clutching his broken sword. There was a moment of shocked silence and then Baratheon turned to face him. By all the gods! Are you all right there, Kingslayer? He stepped forwards and reached out with one massive hand. Jaime took it and then was jerked to his feet in one powerful pull. What happened? Jaime looked at his sword, or what was left of it. It had shattered at a point about a foot above the hilt. He'd never seen anything like it. I don't know, he said dazedly. It broke. Well, you're bleeding, someone fetch a maester. Baratheon shouted, and it was then that he felt the trickle of blood running down his face. As someone placed a stool behind him and as he sank down onto it he looked at what remained of the sword. So much for best Westerland's steel. If father heard about this then he'd probably kill the smith who had forged it. Well, so much for your sword, Baratheon rumbled. That's peculiar. Most peculiar, your grace, Sir Barristan said. Most odd. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was squatting amidst the shards on the floor, his fingers running over the pieces carefully. He held one up. Corrosion. Jaime took the proffered piece and stared at it. The inside of the blade was rusted. He gaped at it. That isn't possible. How can it be corroded from the inside? I inspected it once a day. Honed it too. I never saw any sign of corrosion. I know you did, Sir Barristan said, confusion in his own voice. I watched you do it on so many days. I would never have missed any such rust, and how could it only be on the inside? I know not, the Lord Commander rumbled. And yet it happened. Passing odd indeed. More than passing odd, Jaime thought as a maester hurried towards him with a clean cloth and a bowl of water. He might have a scar after this. What would Cersei say? And then he saw the thoughtful look in Sir Barristan's eyes as he looked at the corroded inside of his sword. And for the briefest moment he felt some indefinable emotion. Benjen. He'd been up by the Fist of the First Men before, but not that much in the hills to the north of it. He'd asked the enigmatic man leading him about just why it was called the Fist of the First Men, but all he'd gotten in reply had been that the place had seen battles but that it was no longer safe. The walls are weak and the caches are too well hidden, Cold Hands had told him. And the others know it too well. That's the reason why Overlook was built. And that had been all he'd say. They were riding now along the bottom of a valley between two hills, and up ahead he could see a great cliff. He'd seen this valley before, but he'd never gone into it, as there was no way out of it if attacked. As he rode he frowned at the ground. There was what appeared to be a path here and there, but it looked long neglected. As they approached the cliff he looked at it, puzzled. There was no way through there, surely. And then Cold Hands guided his elk around one crag and then another, and then a crack in the cliff emerged, one wide enough to admit the antlers of the elk. As they passed into it and the light started to fade they turned a corner and suddenly they were in a cave, with old gates to one side with runes carved into them. Light was shining down from an opening far above them and he could see that one wall had iron rings hammered into the rock. It was a stable. Cold Hands tied his elk up and then pulled his saddlebags off, and as Benjen did the same with Wanderer the other man used what looked like a very old and well-used tinderbox to light a pair of brands that had been one of many carefully piled up to one side. I always keep a supply ready, Cold Hands said quietly. Just in case. He waited until Benjen was finished with Wanderer and then he held one of the brands out. Here. Benjen took it and then followed the other man as he walked over to an opening in the cave that turned out to be a roughly carved passage that curved leftwards and slightly upwards, until they came to an old stone door that was open. On the other side were stairs that spiraled upwards, carved out of the living rock. The Overlook, Cold Hands said as he entered. Once a base of Rangers of the Night's Watch. Benjen stared about him in bewilderment. He had never heard of this place at all. This a goodly place to have north of the wall. Why did it come to be abandoned? I know not, brother, Cold Hands muttered. The last ranger to come here spoke of pestilence among the Night's Watch and fading memories of the things that were important. He died here. I burned his body and his ashes wait to be taken back to the wall. He was a Blackwood. He nodded. I shall take them back with me. Silence fell as they passed on upwards, and after a while Benjen realized that he had lost count of the number of steps they had taken. And then suddenly he saw light up ahead and then another doorway. Beyond that was another cave, or was it 3 of the walls were carved stone, but the other was a wall of well-worked stones, with holes at irregular intervals along it. Some kind of crystal, clear as glass in places, was in the holes. There were doorways off to one side and he could see what looked like stripped wooden cots in them. There was another room off to one side and he could see what seemed to be a great wooden desk, blackened with age. The place was warmer than he had first thought. There is a warm spring beneath. Another passage leads there. And the windows overlook the approaches to the Fist of the First Men. I have seen the others there sometimes of late. They know it too well. You must warn your brothers on the wall. He looked around again. I wish I had known of this place before. I come here sometimes to remember. Cold Hand's voice seemed to quaver for an instant. Once this place was very different. Benjamin looked at the other man, his mind filled with questions. Who was he? Come to that, what was he? How old could he be? He was about to ask one of many questions when Cold Hands raised a hand. You must wait here for a day. Let me scout the area out. If there are whites nearby, then I shall find out where. You will need proof. And there are some means to provide it in the office of the first ranger. There are cages for hands, forged by the first men. I must go. And with that he left. Benjamin listened to the receding footsteps and then sighed a little. Well, now he should probably look at this office. Office of the first ranger, eh? When had that been? When had anyone been here from the wall last, in years? Perhaps there would be records, or at least some mention. But first he walked over to the wall and those openings. He could see clear across the valley, right to the foot of the Fist of the First Men. This was a valuable place, somewhere that the Rangers needed to use again. This was a place of deep history. He turned back to the other room. He needed more answers. Tormund. He wondered where the bloody hell Mance was and then dismissed it. The man would turn up eventually. He didn't like the fact that he'd gone south so quickly, telling others that he had to talk to the Stark in Winterfell, but then he'd had trouble not following him after he had heard the call. It had gone through the free folk camps like a bolt of lightning. Oddly enough, something had also gone through the giants, all of whom seemed shaken. Old ways awaken, Vinvan had told him in the old tongue not long afterwards. Old things awaken. Good and bad. Magic comes. And then the shaggy giant had shrugged and wandered off. He ducked under the lintel of the hut and looked around the camp. It was a fine day, if a little colder than the day before. The camp had grown again overnight and the sentries had reported that a new group had come in an hour or so past dawn. Saigon, the son of the Magna of Than, was standing off to one side, talking to a messenger on a shaggy little horse. As Tormund approached, the rider nodded to Saigon and then booted the horse into a walk and then a trot. Trouble? Tormund asked. Ache, word from Than. My father wants me to go to the wall and meet with the Stark. He'd better have that bloody fist. He eyed the tattooed man worriedly. He had no idea what the bloody hell he was talking about. The Than kept mentioning some kind of fist, but he had no idea what they were talking about, especially as they never explained. Vinvan wandered past at that point, clutching a tree trunk with a sharpened base in one hand and a rock in the other. New hut, he muttered. Needs stick. Tormund nodded affably, as it seemed the only thing that he could do. Raider will be back in a few days, or so I am told, he said to Saigon. And then we will bloody learn what he has been up to in the south. And there was a thudding noise as Vinvan suddenly dropped the rock he had been using to hammer the trunk into the ground. The giant was sniffing the air with deep snorts of air and what looked like a frown under all that hair. Alarm stirred in him. Was he smelling a threat? He knew that giants had poor sight but a bloody good sense of smell. And Vinvan was smelling something now. What? What's in the wind? Tormund called. If anything, the giant seemed puzzled. Riders come, he said eventually. Our kind. From west. Many. But, who? He turned to look west, or rather to sniff to the west. Tormund looked westwards and then he saw the sentries start to wave and shout on the western edge of the encampment. And then he saw them. Huge figures in the distance. Giants on mammoths, at least 100 of them. He stared. 100. That had to be half the number that still even bloody lived. And if Vinvan didn't know them. The giant was striding towards the west now and he trotted to join him, Saigon to one side. Many of us, Vinvan said in astonishment as he kept sniffing. You see. 100 I'd say. I sees them, Vinvan. I sees them there. The giant looked at him in what he now knew was their look of astonishment and then he redoubled his speed. When they reached the edge of the encampment he stopped dead. Someone in the approaching group must have seen or smelled Vinvan, because all of a sudden a horn was sounded, loud and brassy. Vinvan put his hands together and then roared a response back and Tormund could tell that it was a joyful one. The group started to slow, which was good as they were making the bloody ground shake, and then Vinvan stiffened as he sniffed and then he broke into a run. Tormund ran with him, baffled. One of the mounted giants slithered off his mammoth and then ran towards Vinvan and the two came together in a thud of chest against chest and then a great roaring bear hug. The two giants seemed to be crying and wailing and laughing all at once. Tormund and Saigon watched, bewildered. Brother! Vinvan cried eventually through snot and tears. Brother! Thought dead. Tormund looked at Saigon, who shrugged. A reunion. He looked at the massed ranks of giants. Didn't think there were this number left in the west. Neither did Vinvan. By the way that the giant was crying, he was bloody right about that too. And then his brother rumbled something at him, and Vinvan stiffened again, this time in total shock. He stared at his brother and then rumbled something back at him. There was a long moment of silence and then Vinvan sniffed the air and then turned to them. Tormund man. Yes. Brother brought a child. This was bloody odd. A bairn. A young one. A young what? Vinvan stared at him, puzzled. Bairn. What child? Vinvan seemed confused and then talked to his brother again, who then waved his long arms at another giant, who was leading a mammoth. The ground shook a little as they approached and then the giant brought his steed to a halt and then reached up and pulled something down from the saddle. It was a kind of nest almost of furs, almost half the height of a man, maybe smaller. The giant walked over to them and very gently laid it down. Tormund peered at it, confused. And then deep within the nest something stirred. A little hand with 3 fingers and thumb, all tipped with black nails, reached up and pulled one of the furs to one side. There was a face there. It was brown, almost black, and old. Very old. Like a crone. And then the eyes opened and he almost pissed himself in shock. The eyes were large and green and looked like those of a cat. They also seemed to be very interested in him. I know you, the voice spoke the old tongue and was weak but seemed to have great intensity behind it. I have seen you before. You have. He paused. He had squeaked. He was Tormund bloody giantsman and he did not bloody squeak. In a vision. A sigh emerged from the little creature. First man, I am. Heartstring. You are one of the children of the forest, Saigon whispered reverently and Tormund felt his own eyes widen in wonder. But, you were said to have passed from this world. Not even the Than have seen any sign of your kind for many long years. The wizened little face smiled a smile of deep sadness. We hid, first man. We hid. We could not hear the others and it took time to realize why. We thought that we were dying. And we were. I am the last of my clan. There are other clans, but I am the last of mine. I was protecting my brothers and sisters here, in the mountains to the west, and before that beyond. Beyond the frost fangs. Tormund choked. Truly. Truly, first man. Now, listen. I am dying. The nearby giants made snuffling noises of sadness and grief and Heartstring smiled sadly at them. I have lingered too long already, my friends. But I had to get you to safety. To your friends. The little creature looked back at Tormund and pierced him with a gaze that seemed to go right through him. Where is the one who leads you? I must speak with him. Mance Rayder. He is here, said a low voice behind him, and he turned in relief to see Mance striding up to them, his eyes wide with wonder of his own. You are one of the children of the forest. I am Mance Rayder. I lead here. Yes. I saw you too. In a vision. Another sad smile. I am Heartstring. I came to bring these to you to protect. And I came to warn you. The ancient enemy comes. He gathers his strength for a great blow. You must flee south, to the wall. And beyond it. Mance nodded sharply. I know. I have spoken to the Stark in Winterfell. He will tell the Night's Watch to allow us past the wall and into the gift. He eyed Saigon. And he wields the Fist of Winter. I have seen it. The man from Than stared at him in shock. This seemed to bring Heartstring to life for a moment, because a wizened hand emerged and gripped Mance's own hand tightly. Truly. The Stark holds the fist. Truly. Mance smiled. I have seen it. The little creature released its grip and then smiled. Then the first men are, indeed, awake. The giants felt something. Magic stirs, the eyes closed and then opened again. My time grows short. My kind have long lives, but even we can die. Long years lie on me. Much grief, and much joy. Listen to me, Mance Raider. You must go to the wall. To the oldest place there. The place that is cursed. The Night Fort. Why there? You and this one, bright of hair, must go. You will meet others there. The man with the golden mind and the boy who died and fell through time. The old gods grow strong again. They will be watching. They will protect you. But you must go there. Why? Why the Night Fort? The hidden gate. It must admit the man you find. North of the wall there. He must be brought through. Only then can he lay down his burden. Long years he has borne it. At a great cost. He stands between life and death. We saved him long ago. He must pass on what he bears. Only then can he sleep. I don't understand, Mance muttered. What does he bear? Heartstring sighed bitterly and wearily. He, or was it a she? Seemed to be weakening again. When the wall was built, it was by men. And with our help. But the men did not understand the way that our magic works, not truly. They erred. They cut the links between here and south of the wall. They could still see, but we could not. Long years it took before it was clear. And when it was, we thought we could repair it. A great magic was prepared. But the man it was entrusted to, he was found by the ancient enemy. They almost killed him. We saved him, so to speak. But he could not pass the wall. Pass on the magic he holds. He waits still, driven by his duty. And those men who knew of him died. You have such short lives, you first men. And short memories. You will know him when you see him. And his successor. The child of the forest seemed to be sinking fast now. I die now, but you must know something. The ancient enemy, his great blow will come soon. By the sea. Whites gather. South of the Frostfangs. I felt it. Magic. Terrible magic. Be warned. Be watchful. Warn your people. Warn the Stark. Watch the sea. Another smile. Scatter my ashes at the sacred hill place in the land of the rivers. And with that the hand went limp and the eyes closed. Everyone watched, but the little figure was no longer breathing, and after a long moment the giants threw their heads back and wailed at the skies in grief. I will build fire, Van said eventually, wiping his face with his huge hands. Burn Heartstring. I will help, Saigon said quietly. As giant and man started work, Mance took Tormund to one side. How many more have come in? 10 more settlements. You really talked to Ned Stark? I did. He knew that the others have returned. He sent the call out. The Night's Watch are stirring again, they have volunteers flocking to the wall. Things have changed, my original plan no longer stands. And yes, the Stark said that we can pass south of the wall. What of the Black Crows? Mance rubbed at his face. He looked dead tired and more than a bit dirty. He'd been pushing himself hard, he could tell. They have heard the call too. And they rely on Ned Stark to call his banners when needed. He told me that he will call his banners against the others and not on us. And he said that he will make the Night's Watch see that. He paused. We've been lucky, Tormund. He didn't know about the call. His father did, and his older brother, but he knew nothing about the warning signs. There's something else. He claims to have been granted a vision of Hopeman by the old gods. Terror trickled its way up and down Tormund's back. Really? Really? He described it to me. He described it true. He's been given a warning from the old gods, so what he did not know before he knows now. And now, with this, he gestured at the body of Heartstring. We have been warned. We must run for the wall. Sigorn broke off from building the pyre to join them. I will send word to my father. The Thun will march with you. The Fist of Winter and the Stark command us now. He nodded shortly and then went back to the pyre. I'll order everyone to prepare, Tormund muttered. The wall it is then, and ride fast. Robb. He found father in his solar, hefting the Fist of Winter with a frown. The weapon must have been as heavy as it looked, judging by the way that father's tendons were straining. After a moment father noticed him. Robert would laugh himself sick if he saw me holding this, he said with a wry smile. Then the smile vanished. I'm going to have to learn how to use this, Robb. This is important. There will be those who will say that the Stark in Winterfell must wield the Fist of Winter. And if this is magic, or linked to magic, then I must truly know how to wield it. He snorted. Roderick Castle hasn't taught me how to use a new weapon since, well, I was a boy. Before I was sent to foster at the Eyrie. Robb nodded and then sat. So much has changed since I came back, he mused thoughtfully. I can scarce believe how much has changed. The hearthstone, the call, Domeric Bolton, the room by this solar, so much else. Daisy especially. There was never any word of her being on the road in that other time. None whatsoever. Not before the king came, or afterwards, when I led the banners south to try and free you. He felt his voice quaver for a heartbeat and father looked at him quickly. Do not regret it, not for one moment, father said softly. Yes, in that other world you made mistakes. You were too young, too unprepared, you did not know so many things. You did not know of the madness of Balon Greyjoy, or of the ambition of Roose Bolton. You did not know how ruthless Tywin Lannister can make himself be. And you did not know that the others were coming. He nodded again. But now I know. Now we know. And we are preparing. But we must tell Robert. He sank into a chair. And that is what worries me. He was a little heavier than I was used to when we smashed the Greyjoys, but from you told me of Robert's visit here, along with Jory Castle's account of what he saw in the Red Keep, how could have sunk so low? He was unhappy, Father Robb said gently. The first thing he did when he came here was to ask you to show him Aunt Lyanna's tomb. And his marriage to Cersei Lannister was poisonous. I think he was deeply unhappy. But you said that his recent messages were different, a new sword. That was new. Mayhaps things are changing to the south as well. The call. It was father's turn to nod, more thoughtfully. Yes, and we need to think most carefully about that. The Blackwoods have sent me a raven. The Brackens too. The call has made them set aside their ancient blood feud. The Red Fort pledges their support, and then there's this. He handed over a message. Robb took it and read it. And then he read it again, baffled. The runes glow. The others come. House Royce stands with the Stark in Winterfell. We are coming. He looked at father. What runes? Father drummed his fingers on the table and then shook his head. I know not. Runestone is an odd place, Robb. House Royce is of the First Men, one of the few major houses in the Vale to keep to the old ways, but they are secretive. Jon Arryn once told me that there are places in the fortress that the Royces forbid people to see, places that are sealed off. Perhaps they have unsealed them. I'll find out more. If Bronze Yohn Royce really is coming, then that will be something that will shake the veil. So, more politics then. Lord Arryn will want to know. More politics. I need to meet with John and Robert. Every time I pick up a quill to write a letter to them, something seems to happen though. I just hope that I have done enough to warn John. From what you told me, his death was the fault of the Lannisters. Father Robb said slowly, two things worry me. First, how can you tell King Robert about his wife and her brother? How can you prove it? Oddly enough, Father looked smug at this. Don't worry too much about that, Robb. I have a plan. The old keep will be repaired first, the broken tower last. Or so it will seem. I'll show you later. What's the other worry you have? He gestured at the fist. That worries me. Is it magic? Does it contain magic? I mean, in the tales there are stories of weapons only responding to people of the right blood. We are Starks, Father, but you are not the king in the north. Not in this time. Does the fist have magic that is activated by Stark blood, or because it's wielded by the king in the north? There was a long moment of silence as Father looked at the mace and ran a thumb over his chin. You raise a good point. One that occurred to me as well. Lewin is consulting the histories. I was wondering as well when the fist was last seen in public. Torrhen Stark bore ice when he knelt to Aegon, not the fist. Who knows when it was hidden from plain sight? And why? Perhaps he was afraid that Aegon would have taken it. Or that the dragons might have melted it. The long fingers of his father drummed on the table again. Mayhaps he thought that. But the fist fell out of history earlier than that. I do wonder why. Father seemed to shake himself briefly, like a wolf awaking from a nap. Anyway, this talk of ice reminds me of something. There will be a formal ceremony later for this, but I want to tell you now, face to face. Robb sat up straighter. There was a weight to Father's voice now, a depth of solemnity that only Father could convey. I will train with the Fist of Winter. It will be my burden, my duty, to carry it. I am the Stark in Winterfell. That leaves ice. From this day forth it will be the weapon of the heir to House Stark. It will be yours, Robb. Yours until you have a son of your own to pass it on to, so that you can wield the fist when I am dead. He looked at Father and felt his throat close up for a moment, and he remembered the horrible tide of grief that had washed over him when he had heard of his death, betrayed and all but murdered in that shithole known as King's Landing. Thank you, Father, he said hoarsely. I will wield it with honor. Be sure you do, Father said gruffly. As I said, there'll be a ceremony later today. Great John put my mind to it. He made a note to thank Great John Umber, when something occurred to him. Father, he said cautiously, what do you make of the arrival of Tyrion Lannister? His father leant back in his chair again. Another change from the time that you returned from. He seems a smarter man than his reputation led me to believe. And as he has a reputation as a drunkard with a love of whores, then I wonder if he has been hiding his lantern under a bush. He saw the threat posed by the wildlings in an instant. Robb nodded and then pulled a slight face. How has Mother taken his arrival? Better than I had thought, given how in that other future she was convinced that he'd given orders that Bran be murdered in his sickbed. Father sighed. I think that she's trying not to think too much about that, given that her actions started an eventual war. Besides, the more I think about it, the less I think that Tyrion Lannister sent the man with the dagger. The only reason we thought that was the dagger, and Pater Baelish told us about that. Given his attempt to kidnap Robert Arryn, well, let's just say that we don't trust him very much. No, we'll trust Tyrion Lannister just enough to let him see that we face a war here. He might be able to convince his very skeptical father. It's Tywin Lannister I'm worried about. The man's a prickly, humorless, ruthless cyst on the backside of Westeros. Unfortunately, he's also powerful and rich and sees himself as a great military commander. We must be wary of him. He'll need proof. And from what I have heard, he does not like his own son. He shook his head wearily. Robb nodded and then was about to ask Father why Mother had suddenly started being so civil to John, when a fist hammered at the door to the solar. My Lord Maester Lewin shouted from the other side. Ravens. Come in, Lewin, Father said, and they both stood as the older man hurried in. There was something in his eyes that told Robb that something had happened, and the maester held out 2 messages. From King's Landing. Lewin puffed. I ran to bring these to you. Father's eyebrows went up, and then he took the first and read it quickly. As he did, his eyebrows went up even further. Lord Peter Baelish has been arrested and stripped of his titles and positions by order of the hand of the king. He is accused of peculation and thievery of the king's coin. He is to face immediate trial, and all of the lords of Westeros are to inspect their holdings to see if Baelish owned anything or was tied to anything in their holdings. He looked at them. Well, he said brightly, it seems that the problem of Littlefinger has been taken care of for the time being. Lewin, bring the account books. We must search for signs of Littlefinger. There's a list of his false names in business dealings. And the other letter? Robb asked. Father opened it and then went quite still. Baelish was tried by Jon Arryn and Stannis Baratheon. He was found guilty and then accorded a trial by combat. He lost. He's dead. He lowered the letter. That was fast. It's good that he is no longer a threat, but that was faster than I thought. I think that the raven with the first letter was injured on the way north, my lord. It seems to have a strained tendon on one wing. Father nodded absently. The letter has more information about Littlefinger's peculations. Names as well. Very well, Robb, you and Lewin go through the account books. We have properties and businesses to seize that are now our property. And I will tell my wife of this. She will not grieve for the man that he became, but she will weep for the boy she once knew. Tyrion. The direwolf fascinated him. And he seemed to fascinate her, judging by the way that she would look at him and then look at the other men and then tilt her head to one side. She probably thought that he was a child or something. Speaking of children, she looked as if she was going to whelp any day now. He turned and continued his walk around Winterfell. The place both intrigued and worried him. Oh, it was a place that was preparing for war, all right. But it was looking north, to the wall, not south. He wondered, not for the first time, how he was going to word his letter to father. Carefully for one thing. Hearing voices to one side, he looked over to see a young Stark. Bran was it. Being patiently mentored by an older boy about the joys of archery. When he finally saw the sigil on the older boy's cloak, he repressed a scowl. A Greyjoy. Lovely. A squiddling a long way from the sea. Probably better not to go anywhere near the lad, lest Jaime hear about it and then complain that he stank by association. So he turned to one side and wandered over to the trees he could see in one corner. A godswood with actual weirwood trees, how novel. The one in King's Landing didn't have any. As he wandered through the trees, he sniffed the air. The smells of a real godswood were subtly different. There was a pool to one side, by a heart tree, and he shuddered a little as he looked at the face carved into it and the red sack that looked like bloody tears. It looked old. Old, and yet there seemed to be something about it that looked vaguely familiar. He looked at the tree carefully. Odd, there was new growth here and there, as if it had started to grow again. As he approached the carved face, a breeze picked up and rustled the leaves, and as it did, he could almost imagine that he heard a voice whispering something just a fraction too low to make out. And then he froze. Someone was watching him, he was sure of it. He looked around carefully. No, there was no one there. Imagination. Probably. He'd be imagining Snooks and Grumpkins next. He reached out and ran a hand gently over the white bark of the tree. And then he heard the sounds of someone approaching. He turned and then saw a tall young man with distinctly stark features wandering through the godswood, apparently lost in his own thoughts. After a moment he caught sight of Tyrion and stopped with a slight frown. Who are you? Tyrion Lannister, he replied, with a touch of Lannister hauteur. Of obviously. Casterly Rock. And you are? Jon Snow, the young man replied, before seeming to catch himself. Or rather Jon Stark. I think. You think? You don't know. Father has written to the king, asking that I be made legitimate. Ah, so this was Stark's bastard son. He certainly looked enough like Stark. Father had occasionally wondered about the identity of the boy's mother, although he hadn't wondered so hard that people went out and found out more about it. And now Stark was legitimizing him. All very heartwarming, but why? And then a chill ran through him. Stark wanted as many Starks around him as possible. A wise move when faced with war. Father would probably do the same at Casterly Rock. A pleasure to meet you, John Stark. I was just looking at your godswood here and comparing it to the one in King's Landing. The lad nodded absently. Is there not one in Casterly Rock? This was a good question. Yes, he said with a frown of thought. The Stone Garden, we call it. But it's not like this. This is very northern. The Stark boy looked a bit confused at this. Just a godswood. You should see the one in the Wolf's Wood. Now that's ancient. Tyrion looked at him. I wasn't aware that Winterfell had two godswoods. Jon Snow /Stark nodded, a faraway look on his face. We found it on the night that we found the direwolf. And then he shivered a little before looking at the heart tree. Your pardon, but I need to pray. Of course, Tyrion said with a smile. He stepped to one side and then watched as the Stark boy knelt in front of the tree, bowed his head and closed his eyes. Tyrion looked around idly and then started to walk away in search of perhaps a cup of wine, when all of a sudden the boy spoke again. Tyrion Lannister. He stopped dead in his tracks. The boy had spoken in a voice unlike his previous one. Deeper for a start, with a hint of mountains collapsing in the far distance. Yes. The boy turned around and then opened his eyes, and Tyrion found himself torn between running, pissing himself in terror, and being absolutely fascinated. Jon Stark's eyes were, well, there was red fire in them. Or that was what it looked it. Descendant of Lan the Clever, Lan Casterly. Loyal to the Stark in Winterfell, unlike his faithless father. What? Tyrion squeaked and then wanted to curse. He sounded as if he had been kicked in the nether regions. I mean, can I help you? Whoever you are. You must go to the Night Fort, Tyrion Lannister. There you will find the answers that you seek. The others come. Casterly Rock must be warned. The red fires seemed to intensify in the eyes of the boy. The lion must shed his pride. Jon. The name was cried by a horrified-looking young girl with brown hair, grey eyes, and the undoubted look of yet another bloody Stark. Your eyes. Tyrion stepped towards her and held up a hand. Do you know what this is? She stared at him, obviously confused, and then nodded hesitantly. It happened to father not long ago. On the night he found the direwolf. It's the old gods. Jon Stark peered at her. Worry not, young warg. But Tyrion Lannister must be warned. The Night Fort, Tyrion Lannister. You must help the wandering man through the gate. You will know when. The eyes flared again, and then the fire vanished as the grey eyes of the boy reappeared. A boy who blinked at them both, confused. Arya. When did you arrive? I was kneeling by the heart tree. How did I get here? Tyrion took a deep breath. Well, your eyes turned red for a start. Red fire. It was almost unnerving. Then you told me to go to the Night Fort at some unspecified time. The young man turned white. Red fire, he turned to the girl. Arya. Did you see this? She nodded wordlessly, and he sank onto his haunches and then ran his hands through his hair, disordering it. And then he stood. We must see father and tell him about this. Oh, and you said that I was a warg, Arya Stark pointed out. She seemed positively gleeful about it. Isn't it exciting? Her brother just looked at her for a long moment. Father Solar, he said firmly, now. You too, if you please, Lord Tyrion. He nodded and followed them. As they walked through the trees and back out into the main courtyard of Winterfell, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees around them again, and once again he seemed to hear a whisper of words too low to make out. He made up his mind there and then that he would return to this place. Something seemed to be calling him. Robb. He peered at the ledger, running his finger down the carefully written entries. Then he paused, looked at the names on the letter from King's Landing, and then smiled tightly. And there's another. A warehouse company in White Harbor. Apparently owned by a Barrowman, another of Baelish's false names. Fuck, the man had his fingers everywhere. Indeed, my lord. And here is yet another, also in White Harbor. A victualling company in a shipyard. Lord Marndale will not be pleased, although he will be happy to own it. Lewin leant back tiredly. It seems that the late Lord Baelish will not be missed. You speak truly, Maester Lewin. He paused. Lord Bolton will also not be pleased. The Dreadfort has been dealing with a store company owned by a man called Smallkeep. Yet another false name belonging to Littlefinger. There was little warning other than the most cursory of knocks, and then the door sprang open and Arya arrived. She had been running and she looked both excited and a little scared. Arya. What's wrong? She caught her breath. Robb. Where's father? Talking to mother. An old friend of hers has died. Well, was executed. She looked extremely interested in that and started to ask a question, before catching herself and then waving her hands about. Never mind that. Jon was in the Godswood and his eyes went, all fiery, and the old gods spoke through his mouth. Robb came to his feet in an instant, Lewin next to him. What? What happened? She turned to the door and then bounced a little in anticipation, before they finally heard the hurried footsteps, and then in came Jon with, of all the people, Tyrion Lannister next to him. The latter looked shaken. Where's father? Jon asked, looking about the solar. Here, said father as he walked in with a red-eyed mother. Then he froze. What has happened? I was going to pray in the Godswood with Jon, but I could see that he was talking to the imp here. Arya. Mother said, scandalized. Lord Tyrion is our guest. Apologize. Sorry, Lord Tyrion. And then Jon knelt to pray and I was going to join him when all of a sudden he said Tyrion Lannister in a voice like doom, and then he turned around and his eyes were red. Red fire. Just like father on the night that Edric Stark took him over and got the direwolf. And then he said that the imp, Arya. Sorry, Lord Tyrion, was descended from Lan the Clever, son of the faithless Casterly, and that he had to go to the Night Fort to help a wandering man through a gate when the time was right, and then his eyes went out. No, I mean the fire went out and he was Jon again. There was a short silence that was then broken by Tyrion Lannister. I am most impressed, Lord Stark, by your daughter's ability to say all that without apparently breathing in at any point. Robb shot an amused look at the little Lannister and then looked at Jon, who was blushing. Jon said father intently, is this true? I don't know, father, Jon said with an uncomfortable look on his face. One moment I was kneeling before the heart tree and the next I was on my feet and Arya and Lord Tyrion were staring at me. Oh, it's true, Lord Stark, said Tyrion Lannister, and he wandered over to a side table and then helped himself to a cup of wine. Every word of it. Your old gods, or perhaps given the fact that they talked to me, that should be our old gods talked to me. Told me to go, indeed, to the Night Fort. Not entirely sure why, but they seemed very intent. He hopped up into a chair, drank what looked like half the wine in one gulp and then looked at father. So I gather that this has happened before. The night of the direwolf, said father reluctantly. And I have no memories from that night either. Tyrion Lannister swirled the remaining wine in his cup around and then looked at father with surprisingly keen eyes. Your old gods said that Lan the Clever, Lan Casterly, much to my surprise, as the full name of Lan has long been a mystery, was faithful to the Stark in Winterfell. I am guessing that our two houses were once much closer. They were, Lewin said softly. The oldest of the records say that Casterly Rock would send dragonglass obsidian to Winterfell whenever it was found. But no more. Tyrion Lannister drank the rest of the wine. Lord Stark, I was convinced before, somewhat reluctantly, that the others had returned. I am now fully convinced. The old gods are speaking. Perhaps we should listen very carefully to what they are saying. Robb looked around the room. Arya was serious now, whilst Jon was pale, as were father, mother and Lewin. It was Robb who broke the silence. Why the Night Fort? The short man spread his hands. I am to help a wandering man through a gate there. At some unspecified time, although apparently I will know when. He peered at the map. Well, my plan was always to visit the wall. Given how long the Night Fort has been abandoned, I am guessing that it won't be as hospitable a place as Castle Black. It's the oldest of the castles, Lewin muttered, with a black reputation. Some say that it's cursed. Of course it's cursed, Tyrion Lannister sighed. That's my lot in life. Cursed with too big a brain, cursed with too short a pair of legs, cursed with too large a, let me end that sentence there. He hopped down to pour himself more wine and then he paused. 5 days ago I had a dream, Lord Stark. A passing odd one. I was leading men south, into the Reach. The Bone Road was closed, Dawn had abandoned us, King Robert was missing and no word had come from Winterfell in a long time. The dead were marching from Casterly Rock, which had fallen to them, and the Iron Islands were also gone. And then he turned white as a sheet. There was a Lord Greyjoy there, an older version of the boy I saw training your son Bran. Older and far more tired. Why did I suddenly only remember that detail of the dream until now? Surely it was just a dream. Theon Greyjoy can tell you something about dreams, father said grimly. He was marked by a dream. That dream of yours could be important, Lord Tyrion. Try and remember as much of it as possible. The son of Lord Reed is here. He's a greenseer and might see something in you. The Lannister man stared oddly at father and then finally poured himself more wine. I think I also need to word a very careful letter to my father. He will not believe any of this, so I must till the grounds with just the right words. He drank a little. I genuinely don't know what to say in that letter. Jaime. The garden of the Red Keep was a beautiful place, Jaime thought as he wandered through the rose beds with Cersei on his arm. There were times when he could almost imagine what things would be like in a perfect world. That fat fool could have killed you. Cersei spat the words with a venom unique to her as her finger traced the line of the cut. A maester had cleaned the wound carefully and then sewn it shut with as fine a needle and thread as possible. There would be a fine line for a while afterwards, he had been told, but with luck no permanent scar. He raised a languid eyebrow at his sister. The touch of her finger left him burning inside, but they were in a public place and there were certain niceties to be observed. The Fat King can be blamed for many things, my dear sister, but this was not his fault. He pulled out the corroded cross-section of sword that he had been keeping in his pocket. See. She took it and transferred her glare to the piece of metal. After a moment she frowned. Odd. It was rusty inside. It seems so. Peculiar because I never even suspected it. 7 hells, I killed a bandit 3 weeks ago on the road with it. Felt fine in my hands then. Sounded fine as well. He shrugged. I'll get a new one from the Street of Steel. I know you will, she smirked at him. But from the Red Keep. I have a master smith here ready for you. You'll need to attend to give them your measurements for your height and reach, but it will be better than your old one. Less rusty. And every time you plunge it into someone, you'll think of me. There was something hot and rough in her low voice and he quivered with need for her for a long moment. Then he rubbed a finger under his nose and under the cover of it whispered, "Tonight." "Tonight," she whispered back. "The tower." He smiled at her and then pocketed the piece of sword as they sat on a bench. "Father will be angry with the man who wrote this," he said wryly. "Most angry." Then he sobered. "I still don't understand it though." "Pay it no mind, it's just a sword," Cersei said with a shrug, and he was about to tell her off for such words when a scream of utter horror pierced the air. It was long and horrible and filled with such an unutterable pain that Jaime came to his feet in a trice, his hand on the sword he'd borrowed from the armory, looking for a threat. Another scream, one that was somehow even louder and more heartbreaking, and then he heard booted feet running past. He peered over a rose bush and watched as a man in Arryn colors dashed past, panting. "You!" Jaime called. "What's going on?" The man skidded to a halt and looked back, obviously annoyed, only to swallow and nod respectfully as he saw Jaime. "Your pardon, Sir Jaime. Lady Arryn has just caught sight of the head of the traitor Baelish on its spike. She did not know that he was dead apparently." He nodded again and then ran on, leaving Jaime looking at his receding back with bemusement. "Well," he said to Cersei softly, "it seems that Lysa Arryn is rather behind the times. She didn't know that Littlefinger was dead. She had more than a soft spot for him in her heart." Cersei smirked a little. "Such a shame." But Jaime frowned. "She mourns him. No one else did." Then he shook his head. "Ah well." He eyed his sister. And then he hungered for night to fall. Benjen. When morning came he rolled his blanket back up, covered it with the oilskin cloth and then put it back in his bag. breakfast was a rather stale roll and a few dried currants that he'd soaked in water from the spring in the lower part of the overlook. He was memorizing as much as possible about the place for the future. This was a place that the Night's Watch desperately needed. Why had it been forgotten about? Perhaps there was a clue in the solar, or at least that was what he'd named it in his head. The place was cluttered and untidy and he'd only had time to look through it once the previous day before the light had faded, and with all that dust in there he didn't want to walk in with a lighted brand and set fire to anything. The chair looked as if it was about to fall apart, but the desk itself was huge and old. It was also weirwood, which hardened with age. He leafed through everything slowly. There were 2 huge ledgers, closed and fastened with metal binders, and another book that looked badly battered by the years. He started with the ledgers. The paper was very old and yellowed and he had to handle the pages with care, but he could see to his fascination that was a series of accounts of patrols and sightings. The ink was old and faded, and in some places the entries were in the old tongue. As he went from entry to entry over the crackling pages, a theme started to emerge, one of neglect. Fewer and fewer men were sent to Overlook, none seemed to know what the place was for, other than to be used to watch for wildlings. One phrase stood out. Ye traditional weapons. What traditional weapons? Apparently a final set of caches had been buried at the Fist of the First Men. Where? It didn't say. Then there was the other phrase. The Wanderer was that cold hands. Had been seen here and there, the Wanderer had been given fresh supplies, the Wanderer had been asked about the disappearance of the children of the forest. Wait, what? The Rangers had once had dealings with the children. He pored over the book more carefully. From what he could tell, there had been isolated sightings here and there until he blanched. 400 or 500 years before the arrival of Egon. How old was this book? Was it a copy of a copy of a copy? But if the Wanderer was Cold Hands, then how old was he? What was he? The last entries in the book were in the thin, spidery scrawl of an old man, and they spoke of neglect and abandonment. Few rangers knew about the place. Pestilence of some sort had broken out back at the wall, supplies were few. The last entry read simply, "My watch is done." He ran a finger over the words with sadness and then frowned. He went back to his saddlebags and hunted through them for his own small bound book. He used it to record eventful happenings north of the wall whenever he could, and he had a metal quill that his father had bought him a long time ago and a pot of ink. Opening the latter, he peered into it, grunted with satisfaction at the sight that it was still liquid, and then returned to the book. Selecting a new page, he carefully wrote out a new entry. I, Benjamin Stark, 1st Ranger of the Night's Watch, did restart the occupation and usage of Overlook, paying homage to the memories of those who came before me. Then he carefully dated it. It felt right to have done it. Closing the journal, he looked about. The second book was one of more formal accounts and supplies, and he closed that after a few moments of silent pondering. Then he turned to the third one. This was very different. It looked as if it had been hastily assembled out of whatever paper and parchment was around, and the first pages made no sense. All that was on it was a set of smearing scrawls, like the first attempt of a child to write. It was in charcoal, and whoever had written it had smeared the page badly. He kept turning the pages. More scrawls, but with a hint of actual letters here and there. He went on a few pages and then stopped and stared at the page in front of him. No. Impossible. He flipped to the last page with writing on it. By now it was clear. Just the same 2 lines, but this time it was readable. Benjamin closed the book and replaced it. Ned needs to know about this, he said quietly. And soon. It was then that the little cages caught his eye. They were set into recesses on the stone wall to one side, and there were 5 of them. Oh, and there was a 6th, much larger one. He eyed them carefully. These must be the cages that Cold Hands had mentioned, and he pulled one out of its recess, and gently blew the dust off it, before clearing the more stubborn dust off the runes carved along one side of it. Cage-proof, or possibly, cage certain, he wasn't sure which. The wording was old and archaic. Then he looked at the larger one. Ah. Big enough to contain a head. Yes, that might be one way to convince someone like Tywin Bloody Lannister, although the thought of riding through the 7 kingdoms with a severed head that appeared to be alive gave him a shudder of horror. He pulled the cages out and then lined them up along the desk. Very well then. He had the tools for the job. Now he just needed to find some whites. He strode back into the larger room, replacing his things in his saddlebags and then meticulously readied himself. His sword was already sharp, but he carefully honed it again, just to make sure, along with the short sword that he also carried as a reserve. And then he thought carefully about every legend he'd ever heard about whites. Fire apparently killed them, as even if you sliced them into pieces those pieces would still move about. Which was the whole point of the cages. Hearing footsteps he tensed a little and then relaxed as cold hands appeared in the door to the stairs. The other man nodded. Brother, I have found whites. 6 of them. We must be wary. Benjamin looked at him. 3 to 1 are poor odds. Cold Hands shrugged. I've fought at worse odds. Besides, we have weapons here. He walked into one of the rooms off to one side and pulled out an ancient-looking bag, from which he pulled out some clay bottles that had been stoppered. Oil. Whites do not react well to fire. Benjamin nodded and then shouldered his saddlebags. Will we be returning here? The cages are on the desk. We shall. One last thing. If, when we are fighting the whites, it gets even colder than it already is, run. The cold means that one of the others is approaching, and unless you have dragon glass on you then you will die if you try to fight it. Cold Hands said the last words with a terrible intensity and Benjamin nodded carefully. They trotted down the stairs to the cave that also served as a stable, where Wanderer wickered at him in greeting. He gave him a small handful of oats, checked that his steed didn't need water and then quickly saddled him. As Cold Hands led the way out of the cave on his elk he pointed at the gates. These should be closed at night. No night patrols, brother, not now. It's too dangerous. When the doors are closed then this place is safe. It's warded. I understand, Benjamin said quietly. No night patrols and the gates to be closed. And then they were outside. Cold Hands led then on a wide, swinging path, first east and then straight dead north. At one point he slowed and seemed to sniff the air. The free people are moving south, he said quietly. The giants too. Things are moving faster than I feared. Benjamin looked sideways at him for a moment. I read the ledgers, he said carefully. There was talk in them of the children of the forest. Are they all gone now? His question resulted in a long moment of silence from Cold Hands, before a sigh emerged from the man. I cannot tell you. He shook his head. There are things about which I cannot speak, brother. The three-eyed crow could tell you, but that is for another day. Benjamin absorbed this in silence as they rode along, now traveling down a long wooded valley. Cold Hands had not said that they were gone, just that he could not speak of them. Perhaps some still lived. That was less of a surprise than he would have thought just a few months ago. A flash of red to one side caught his eye and he looked over to see a heart tree to one side, a very old one. Who had carved the face on that one? When? Had it been done by one of the first men or a child? As they rode out of the valley Cold Hands raised a closed fist and brought his elk to a halt. Tether your steed to a tree, brother. We go on from here on foot. We want no warning to reach them. Benjamin nodded again and then slipped off Wanderer, before leading the horse to the nearest tree that he could find with a low branch to tie the reins to. His heart was beating a little faster and he shifted his grip on his sword a little. The other man tethered his elk and then pulled out the clay jars, along with an old cloak and a pair of brands, which he carefully lit. I hope that you can throw, he said as he handed over one of the brands and 2 of the jars. I will call out when and where. Once you do I suggest you use your sword to sever hands and arms. Heads too if you can. I shall, he replied. Lead on. Cold Hands led him down a snowy way until a clump of trees appeared around a corner at the end of the valley. There. Benjamin peered at the trees. I can't see anyone. They are on the ground, covered in snow. Be ready. And with that Cold Hands started to stamp on the ground heavily as they approached the trees. Benjamin was about to ask when he was doing, but then he caught sight of slight movement up ahead. A mound of snow was stirring. Yes, there was someone there. Several others were also stirring and then snow cascaded down and 6 figures were suddenly emerging from the snow. He stared at them as they slowly turned to face them and then started to shuffle through the snow towards them. 3 were not long dead. He could see blood and terrible wounds on them, and they were wildlings, a man, a woman, and most heartbreakingly a child of about 10. All quite dead. 2 others had been dead for longer, judging by the rags and the skeletal faces. And then there was the one in front. The one dressed in black. He had been a member of the Night's Watch once. The color of what remained of the hair and the sword that was strapped to his back, it was old Sir Willem Glover, who taken the black 10 years before and then vanished without trace on a ranging 3 years ago. A brother of ours, Cold Hands said sadly. I will take care of him. Throw your jars at the older whites. We need the fresher ones. Better proof. And with that he threw his first jar straight at the white that had once been Willem Glover. It smashed at once and oil splashed all down the white, and then the brand was thrown straight after the jar, and dear old Sir Willem Glover, or the silent thing that had once been his sworn brother, went up in flames. The terrible thing was that a live man would have screamed, but instead the white never made a sound as it kept on walking. The clothes burned, the hair burned, the face burned, but the white didn't make a sound as it kept walking forwards right up until the moment it stopped walking and fell over. Benjamin swallowed and then threw his own first jar. And missed. He cursed and threw the second one against the leading one of the older whites. If he had been unlucky before, then he got lucky with the second throw, because not only did he hit his target, but he spattered both whites so that when he threw his own brand by some freakish chance they both caught fire. It was the silence that once again struck him, as, other than the roar of the flames, there wasn't a sound in the valley. It wasn't like any other fight he'd ever been in. No shouts of defiance, no bellows of pain, no screams of pain. As the 2 older whites staggered and then fell, Cold Hands drew his own sword and then swept forwards towards the 3 surviving whites. Benjamin also drew his sword and followed him, being careful to stay out of his sword reach. The female white came at him, arms outstretched, a crude metal dagger in one hand. That was the hand that he targeted, and he chopped it off her hand at the wrist, and then severed her left arm at the shoulder. That jarred more than a bit. His sword was ordinary steel, not Valerian steel like ice, and he knew he'd feel it later, especially when he kicked the white in the stomach, so that it staggered back, and then chopped her head clean off. To his horror, the body still kept staggering forwards until he severed a leg with a grunt. It was then that he sensed the child white, which was coming straight for him. A girl, she had once been, and a pretty one. Well, pretty no more. Her lower jaw was gone and her throat was a red ruin. He swallowed and then hardened his head. A roll of his wrists brought the sword around in a double-handed sweep, and her head fell from her shoulders. He reversed the sweep and felt the blade crunch into her spine and then stick. He cursed, tugged at it, and then was lucky enough to free it. Another blow and the child white lay in 2 more pieces in the snow. Panting, he looked around. Cold Hands was watching him, with the severed pieces of the other white on the ground around him. Seeing his look, the other man nodded. Well done, brother. Never easy, to face your first white. But you need to beware what they can do. See, he pointed with his sword, and Benjamin looked down and then cursed and jumped back. A hand was on the ground by his foot, reaching for something to grab. And the other pieces of the whites around him were still moving. Cold Hands spread out the old cloak and then started to wrap various pieces up. A hand here and there, the head of the female white, and then 3 more hands. And then he threw the remaining pieces onto the smouldering remains of the whites that had been killed with the oil, before throwing the other clay jars onto what was now a pyre. Farewell, Sir Willem Glover. And now your watch is done, Benjamin muttered as he looked at the burning remains of the white that he had once knew. I knew him, Cold Hands. I knew him. Then he has been avenged, Cold Hands replied, before looking around. We must leave this place. If we tarry we will be in danger. His skin prickled with fear. Another. Not close, but approaching. Back to the overlook. Wanderer shifted uneasily as they approached, but the elk just looked at Cold Hands and then submitted to being mounted. And then they were off again, at a quick trot, away from the smudge of dirty black smoke behind them in the sky. As they went, Benjamin considered what had just happened. He was the first member of the Night's Watch to battle a white and survive in centuries at least. He had to get back to tell the rest of them at the wall and pass on what he now knew. He just had to. Fire was the weapon of choice against them. What would obsidian do? Perhaps fire arrows. Catapults on the wall. More oil, but that had its own dangers, both to the wall and in the handling of it. Where would they get the oil? Fish oil. Rendered fat. Arrows on their own would not work. And his brothers in the Night's Watch needed to know that. Before he knew it, they were back at the overlook, and as they threaded their way down the valley, he looked at the sun as it shone down through a murky sky. If he started back now, then he could make it to the wall in a few days, riding hard and risking Wanderer. Perhaps it would be worth it. On the other hand, perhaps he should be more careful with his horse. If he exhausted Wanderer on his way south, then this would all have been for nothing. As they arrived back at the overlook and dismounted, Cold Hands turned to him. You should start for the wall as soon as you can. The other will not miss those whites, but he might think that free folk killed them and seek them out. Benjen nodded as he thought about it. I'll avoid Craster's Keep then. Cold Hands stared at him sharply. He must be avoided at all costs. That place is no longer safe. He cannot be trusted. He worships the others. His stomach turned over. What? He worships the others, he is accursed. He gives his sons to the others, so that they leave him alone. Oh, this was not good. Craster was friendly to the Night's Watch and especially the Rangers. Damn it. Then I shall pass word to avoid him, he replied grimly. Or kill him. Cold Hands nodded and then led the way back up the stairs with the slightly squirming bundled cloak in his hands. When they reached the main room, he looked at Benjen. Bring the cages, please. I will keep the pieces separate. He nodded and strode into the study, where he stacked up the various cages and then brought them through. He could see that Cold Hands had started with the hands, which were clenching and unclenching in an effort to what? Get free. Crush something. Kill them. Cold Hands took one of the small cages from him and then opened it carefully at the top. To Benjen's surprise, the hinges did not squeal and he peered at the cage. What kind of metal was it? He couldn't tell. Cold Hands then dropped one of the hands into the cage and then closed it quickly, before moving on to the others. He finished with the head, something that made Benjen shudder. The eyes were open and glared at them both through cloudy films, whilst the mouth opened and closed. The cages will slow the rot to a crawl, but not stop it completely, Cold Hands said quietly as he then packed the cages into a saddlebag. But they will convince any doubters. Some will doubt the very idea, but you are right, he replied as he took the saddlebag from Cold Hands. Then he paused. My thanks for all your help. From the crinkling around the black eyes, the other man smiled. It was my pleasure to help a brother of the Night's Watch. Especially the first ranger. He paused. Which reminds me. Benjen watched as Cold Hands strode off into one of the rooms and then returned with a small wooden box. The last ranger who was here. His name was Hojan Blackwood, son of Eddard Blackwood. He was a good man. Get him safely home, please, brother. He felt his throat constrict in sorrow for a moment. I shall. And then it was his turn to pause. I read the ledgers. Updated the book. Rangers will return here. This pleased Cold Hands, who nodded with looked like every happiness. Good. Good. And I read the other book. Cold Hands bowed his head slightly. Ah. The book. Writing it. Helped me to focus after what was done to me to help me. Then you have questions. Yes, but I know there is no time. I will say this. When first we met I told you that my name was Benjen, son of Ricard. I did not say of what house. My full name is Benjen Stark. Cold Hands' eyes widened and then went to his face. Yes, he said after a long moment. I think I see it in your face. A long time has passed since I last met a Stark. Long indeed. And then he rubbed his gauntleted hands together, as if he was nervous. Tell me, does Winterfell still stand? It does. Winterfell endures, as it always has. Then the crypts are maintained. Always. Then when you return there, find out the tomb of Edwyle Stark and tell him that his son Rickon still holds his mission above all else. I have a duty, you see. I cannot say more, other than I have a mission that I must one day complete. A burden I must share with my successor. And then my watch will be done. There was a tone in his voice that made Benjamin's eyes mist up for a moment, a weariness but also an absolute determination. Whatever was keeping this man, and he was a man, he was no wight, even if he should have been long dead by now going, then it was important. He knew that. Benjamin drew himself up. Farewell, Rickon Stark. You have a namesake in Winterfell, my brother's boy. Farewell, Benjamin Stark. We will meet again, I sense it. Because you know, as well as I, that winter is coming. He nodded, and then he turned and passed through the door to the stable. The wall called him. And he needed to forget the desperate scrawl on the pages of that third book. It ended, "My name is Rickon Stark. My hands are cold, but my heart is still mine." But it started, "Name Rickon Stark. Hands cold. Cold hands." Chapter 13. Chapter text. Oberyn. He found Doran sitting in his chair in the middle of the water gardens again, staring at the distant horizon with a thoughtful look on his face and a lap filled with at least 7 pieces of paper. As he approached, his brother caught sight of him and then smiled slightly. "Brother." "My prince," he said formally, and then sat with a slight smile. "You are well?" Doran pulled a slight face. "More letters have come. Oberyn, another 9 houses of the Stony Dornish have written to me telling me that they are sending men and food and supplies and coin to the wall. They do not ask, they tell me. The eyes of the Stony Dornish are not on Sunspear. They are on Castle Black. And Winterfell." He felt a wince cross his own face. "I thought that might happen. It's happening elsewhere. It's shaking the Reach as well." Doran's eyes flickered at him. "How so?" "My young friend Willers Tyrell wrote to me today from Highgarden. He can walk again without a cane, the rumors were true. He cannot explain it." "Magic then?" Doran said the words with a slightly pained look at his own legs. "I wish that I could say the same. There are certain other things he says, or rather does not say, in his letter. I seem to detect the influence of the Queen of Thorns on him at the moment. He hints that perhaps any meaningful correspondence between Dorne and the Reach should be directed to him and not his father. It is just a hint, just a suggestion, but to me it is clear." Doran looked at him in first surprise and then some satisfaction. "If true, that would be excellent. Dealing with Mace Tyrell is like talking to a child at times. The man's a fool." "You know my views on the Fat Flower," Oberyn replied with a sly smile. "Willers Tyrell on the other hand is very different." His brother snorted with contempt. "Good. It would be hard to think of a bigger idiot for a Lord Paramount than Mace Tyrell. If his son is seeking to quietly supplant him, then the collective intelligence of the nobility of Westeros will take an upward leap. Watching Mace Tyrell play at the Game of Thrones is like watching a blind man try to be an archer." He laughed at that. "Apt, brother. Very apt." Then he sobered. "We will need our friends." Another letter came, from an old friend of mine at the Citadel. A maester called Garin. An odd fellow, one who would rather look at the stars than at his own feet, but a good man. And he says that the stars are shifting. The Starks are always eventually right. Winter is coming, brother, and this one will be a long one. And a bad one, or so Garin thinks. Doran frowned at him. "Do you think he is right?" "I shall observe the stars myself. But I have to tell you that if Garin states something about the stars, there is every chance that he is right." He shifted a little in his seat, a sign of slight nervousness that his brother immediately noticed by his upraised eyebrow. "What else do you need to talk to me about, brother?" "We need more information. I was thinking about sending someone I trust to Winterfell to ask questions. Lots of questions. Someone I trust absolutely." "Who?" "Sarala." Doran's eyebrows flew upwards for a moment and then lowered in thought. "An interesting choice. Of all your sand snakes she is the most curious." "Why though?" "A long winter might be coming, and a bad one. The Stony Dornish are worried enough to send help to their kin far to the north. To the wall. This call that has gone out, it reeks of magic. Old magic, brother, a very old magic. I sense that something has changed in this world. And that all our calculations, all our plans, need to be placed to one side. This made Doran's eyes widen for a long moment. You would give up our plan? And our vengeance against the Lannisters? No. He snapped the word hotly and then made himself calm down a little. Just postpone it a little. He looked at the horizon for a moment. We need information. Sarala can get it, as can I. But we need to find out what's going on. The Prince of Dawn leant back in his wheeled chair and then steepled his fingers under his nose, something he did when he was thinking very hard. Then he looked up. Very well. Send Sarala. Buy a fast ship. Use what money you need. Oberyn leant back. Thank you, brother. Thank me not just yet. The more you look at the stars, the less time you'll have with Elaria. He smirked at his brother. How little you know me at times. Brynden. Brian of Tarth was quite an agreeable traveling companion, he thought as they trotted down the road. For one thing, she didn't feel the need to fill the air with meaningless babble about everything that they were passing. He remembered old Sir Robb Returns and mentally winced. A good friend and a doughty warrior, but by all the gods a man who couldn't keep his mouth shut whilst riding. Dead now, of course. Killed at the Ruby Ford. Brian of Tarth on the other hand kept any conversation down to the bare bones, such as just about the direction they were taking. And they had a better idea of that now. They were heading straight to the God's Eye. He mulled things over as they went down the road. What was this pull? Why did they both feel it? Did others feel it too? Why? Was it the blood of the first men? If so, again, why? What was driving them? They'd taken a pair of rooms in a small tavern in a village the previous night, a place that looked reasonably clean. There had been a certain air of nervousness over the place though, something that had puzzled him right up until the moment that they had seen the Septon as they had left the village that morning. He had been a strange man, that one. Simply dressed with bare feet that had calluses on them, or what could be seen through the dirt. A crown of grey, almost white hair, a look of piety and the eyes of a madman, or at least the eyes of man deep in denial. Greetings, sons of the warrior, he'd started off saying. Have you come to join our noble cause? This had been the wrong thing to say, because Brian had snorted in derision. I am no son, I am a daughter. The Septon had peered at her in what the Blackfish had to admit was some understandable shock at seeing a woman in armor. His next words confirmed this, a woman with a sword. In armor. Brian of Tarth had answered this by gripping her sword with one hand and then leaning forwards in her saddle to direct a hard stare at the bloody man, who had then looked uncomfortable for a moment, before looking back at the Blackfish. We seek men and women of the faith. Ours is a holy task. And then the people who had started to collect around them all nodded. Most holy. And what would that task be then? A strange light had filled the Septon's eyes. Why, to rid the land of the last vestige of heresy. The last symbol of the old ways. Burn the heretics. The growing crowd had shouted. Burn them. What heretics? What symbol? The Septon had looked them up and down. Where are you bound? He had stared back at the man. Where we are bound for is our business. And, with all respect due to a Septon, none of your business. So we will wish you a pleasant day and ride along. He eyed the crowd and then kicked Longshanks in the ribs and rode off, with Brian of Tarth at his side. After a few minutes he had held up a hand in warning. Don't look back. She had shot a curious look at him. I was about to. Why should I not? Because madness is festering behind us. Religious madness. I've seen it before. Don't look back. Too many eyes are watching us. I feel it. They were about to ask us stupid questions about which gods we worshipped. She had mulled this over for a moment. I was brought up worshipping the seven. As was I. I wonder which god sent the call though. And then they had rode on in silence. That had been in the morning. Now the sun had passed the noon mark and was sinking into the west as they came to a crest on the road, then slowed to a half. Ahead lay God's Eye and the island. The Isle of Faces, Brynden muttered. Is it there? Is that where we are drawn? I don't know, his companion replied. But I feel as if I am drawn there. It grows stronger as I look upon it. This was a good point. He said. But if that is where we are bound, then how shall we get there? There must be a village by the shore. People with access to boats. I'm not leaving Longshanks tied to a tree, and it's a bit far to swim. Brian of Tarth nodded seriously, and then they both rowed down the road. Fortunately there was indeed a village by the shore, a larger place than he might have thought. And the moment they reached it, something set off an distant alarm, no, faint warning, in his mind. It was the September that started it. It was freshly painted, but the path leading to it seemed to be quite thin. And then they reached the square in the middle of the village and drew rein. There was a group of people working on some boats by the jetty. And there was a man sharpening a sword to one side as he sat on a bench. A very familiar man. He was dark-haired, although greying and broad-shouldered, and there was a paleness to his face that showed that he had shaved off a beard recently. "You!" Brindon bellowed the word so loudly that birds flew up in the nearby fields. Then he dismounted, tossed the reins to a startled Brian of Tarth, and strode forwards towards the equally startled man, who then blanched with shock at the sight of him. "Robb Returns. God's damn you, man, where have you been?" He stamped to halt and then looked the man up and down. "What happened to you? I had permission from the king himself to knight you after pike. And then you vanished." The old soldier sighed. "Sir Brindon. I am heartily glad to see you. Damn it, man. Where have you been? You and I fought together in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and the rebellion, and then against the Greyjoys." He smiled at last. "I thought you were dead." His old friend smiled sadly. "After pike. I had enough, Sir Brindon. All that blood. All that killing. I thought I found a calling. I became a wandering septon." Brindon stared at the man in shock. And yet, yes, he was not too surprised. A man could only take so much butchery before they cracked. Then he stared at the sword and raised a shaggy eyebrow. Glovett sighed and then looked at him before raising an eyebrow at Brian of Tarth. "Things have changed. Times have changed. Old certainties have shifted. I have heard a call. The others come. The Stark calls for aid. You are needed." He smiled briefly. "I have heard it too. So has my traveling companion. This is Brian of Tarth. Brian, this is Robb Glovett, old soldier, old friend and a good man." She nodded and then tilted her head to one side. A man who sharpens a sword is a man who knows that he might need to use it. Glovett had been gaping at him, but then shook himself like a dog emerging from water. "Well, that's a surprise. The blood of the first men runs strongly in us all, does it not? Ah, the sword. I am indeed needed." He looked over his shoulder at the gathering men and women who had noticed the two new arrivals. "We must protect the Isle of Faces." Something cold settled over him. "We rode through a village to the northeast this morning, filled with religious imbeciles. I seemed to hear the ghost of the faith militant rising from the grave there." Glovett set his chin a little. "The ghost? Nay, it arises red in tooth and claw there. And in other places. Many deny the call, deny it to the point where they claim that it's all a lie. And they will burn alive those who say that they heard the call. Along with the Isle of Faces. It's one of the last weirwoods south of the Neck. It's a symbol. And symbols have power. The septon who burns it to the ground will have great power amongst the faith militant." He rubbed his chin and then looked at Brian of Tarth, who was pale with anger. "We need to get to the Isle. Don't ask me why, because I couldn't tell you. But we are not a threat to the Isle. We will not harm a single tree there. But, we are drawn there. We have heard the call and we are drawn there." The old soldier stared at him a long while. Then he looked around at the silent crowd that had gathered around them. "This man is the uncle to Eddard Stark, the Stark in Winterfell. He is Sir Brindon Tully. He is a good man. He and his companion, Brian of Tarth, have both heard the call. Shall we help him?" And with that the crowd bellowed one word, "Yes." Tyrion. Lord Stark was still reading the history of the first men that the Surestones had been working on for so long, and as a result Tyrion was starting to get antsy. He was quite sure that if he had been given the book then he would have finished it by now, and made notes. But instead he had to wait. So he found himself in the library of Winterfell, surrounded by books that were almost but not quite as good. Some were brand new copies of volumes that had been kept in some secret place by old Rickard Stark apparently. And they were mostly enlightening. The maester here, Lewin, was a very civil fellow who knew his business, oh yes. And he also knew a fellow book lover by sight, based on the way that he had looked at the pile of books next to Tyrion and then added a few himself silently. The more he read the more he could confirm the threads already in place in his mind. The old kings in the north had been powerful indeed, power that came from influence more than power that came from swords or fear. He wondered what his father would have made of that kind of power. Probably curled a lip at the idea of someone not using fear as a tool. Perhaps he was being harsh on father. Perhaps not. He made a careful note in the notebook to one side and then closed it. His stomach was grumbling, it just happened to be dinner time and he needed a goblet of wine. As he reached the great hall he could see other trickling in. And then he saw more people hurry into one side. He frowned and then he saw that Lord Stark was standing at his place at the great table, with his wife next to him and all his children. A pale Robb Stark was just to his left and a solemn Theon Greyjoy was to his right. Once the great hall was filled then Great John Umber stood and stepped forwards. He was an imposing man, huge and raw-boned. Oddly enough it was the man next to him who impressed Tyrion more. Howland Reed was smaller than the Great John but seemed to be more intense. Now they stood before the table, and were joined by Domeric Bolton, a lad besotted and she with him with Sansa Stark. Hear now the words of Lord Stark, Warden of the North. Great John bellowed. The North stands witness. Lord Stark took a step forwards. House Stark has held its vows for many years. And its honor. We have also held Ice, the Valyrian steel sword. But the long night comes. Winter comes, as do the others, and it is time for old things to be renewed. From this day forwards Ice will be held by the heir to House Stark. And I now give it to my oldest son, Robb. He turned to Greyjoy, who placed the great sword in his hands, before turning to Robb Stark, who looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than his face. Tyrion still had questions about that boy. There was something odd about him, something that just couldn't put his finger on. This sword has been a symbol of justice for the North. Wield it with honor. I shall this I swear. Robb Stark said hoarsely and Tyrion wondered what was going through his mind. He tried to imagine father giving him something like Brytro and found his mind failing to picture to it. Frankly he envied Robb Stark at that moment. He could see how proud his father was of him, how proud all of his family were of him. Lady Stark was beaming at him and all of his siblings were also smiling, with the exception of Rickon who was also trying to see if he could steal the piece of bread left on Arya's plate. Robb Stark stepped back and then Lord Stark turned to the hall again. From this day forwards I will wield the ancient weapon of House Stark, the Fist of Winter. Mutters filled the hall suddenly, the sound rising as Jory Castle walked in with the mace in his hands. There was something ancient about it, something that told of an age of man long past, one that just might be returning. Castle bowed formally to Lord Stark and then passed the mace over, before walking over to one of the tables, where Anna, a woman who Tyrion could tell at a glance was passionately in love with the man, shot him a brilliant smile. The big mace was raised in the air by Lord Stark. Winter is coming. Lord Stark barked the words with a grim intensity. Winter is coming. The crowd roared back. Lord Stark nodded and then held up his free hand. Before we eat there is another matter. Just before I came in I received a raven from King's Landing. John, can you join me here please? Stark's bastard son frowned to one side of Tyrion but then stood and joined his father, who smiled at him. I have a message here from King Robert himself. He shot a fierce look about the hall. Jon Snow is hereby legitimized, by the order of the king himself. He is Jon Snow no longer. He is now Jon Stark. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder, which seemed to calm the boy a little, as he was pale-faced and fighting back tears. Join the family at the head table, lad. Cheers went up as the boy numbly walked over to the main table, where Robb Stark greeted him with a hug, followed by the others, young Arya Stark being the second most enthusiastic. Even Lady Stark kissed him on both cheeks and smiled at him. Given what he had heard about her previous attitude towards him, Tyrion found this interesting. What had changed? As everyone started to take a seat and the food started to appear, Tyrion smiled slightly. Yes, he needed food. Wine too. And perhaps a trip to the whorehouse later. He needed to make up his mind about that. You look serious. He started slightly and then looked up at the speaker. Oh. Lady Sherestone. I apologize, I did not see you approach. Hardly a surprise, given the noise. She sat next to him. You had a most odd look on your face when Ned gave Robb that sword. A steaming platter of meat was placed in front of them and he snagged several choice pieces with his fork and then transferred them onto her plate. She smiled at him and then watched as he did the same for his own plate. It gave him a moment to reflect on what to say. He went with honesty. It seemed the best path with this oddly observant woman. I imagined my father giving me such a sword. Sadly, my imagination was not up to the challenge. Ah, she said carefully, a tone to her voice that made him raise an eyebrow. She noticed it and then shrugged. My father rode south with Ned during the rebellion. He met your father in King's Landing. He was not impressed, for various reasons. Ah, he replied, with a slightly different tone to his use of the same word that she had used. Father can be difficult. In many ways. She took a bite of meat and then chewed carefully. Father said that he was a prideful, ruthless, power-hungry man with insanely good luck. He considered this for a long moment. You know, I really can't fault that description of father. Your father was a very perceptive fellow. You aren't offended then? On one level, slightly. However, on my own personal level, not at all. She nodded at that and then seemed to be relieved. He wondered why. He looked back at the head table. I do envy their closeness. The Starks. She smiled at her cousins. They are the best people I have ever known. I meant how much they mean to each other. I had heard that Lady Stark did not like Jon Snow. I beg your pardon, Jon Stark. I do not see any sign of that now. They are not close, but there seems to be no dislike there. He shrugged. Meals at Casterly Rock tend to be dominated by silences from my father, who disapproves of a great number of things. He paused and wondered why he was telling her these things. Another shrug. Family is family. I wouldn't know much about that, Daisy Sherestone said levelly. As I grew up, family was father and mother died some time ago. Plus the odd visit from Ned. No uncles or aunts. She smiled sadly. Dead young. There were more Sherestones once. I am the last of them. He ate from his own plate. I have lost uncles over the past years. Uncle Tidet died. Uncle Geryon, we have no idea where his bones lie. He went looking for Brightraw, the long-lost Valyrian steel sword of the Lannisters. Father traced his ship as far as Volantis. Apparently he planned to sail into the Smoking Sea. If he did, he never sailed out again. She stared at him a long moment and then seemed to be about to say something when a door slammed open to one side and Maester Lewin scurried in. My Lord Stark, he cried as he approached the main table, the direwolf is whelping. Jon are in. Lysa was worrying him. So much so that he had agreed for her to be sent away from the Red Keep. Riverrun perhaps. Yes, that might settle her nerves. Then he paused. Wait, that might actually make her worse. She and Baelish had been brought up there. The Eyrie then. Yes, but under strict supervision. He made a note, handed it to Quill, who nodded and slipped out, and then he left the Tower of the Hand and strode over to the Red Keep. Gods, but he was tired. He had a sense that a great crisis was approaching, a storm that he hadn't previously ever suspected was there. One that a part of him did not believe could possibly exist, but it still did. Turning a corner and acknowledging the nod of Barristan Selmy, he entered the meeting room. As he expected, Robert was waiting there. He seemed almost pensive. He also seemed to be a little thinner again. How hard was he driving himself? Why? That sword was strapped to his back again. It seemed to represent kingship for Robert, he knew that much. The Storm Kings had been mighty monarchs. Jon, how are you this day? Robert asked softly. You look tired. Lysa has been something of a trial, he replied. The death of Baelish upset her greatly. I am having her sent to the Eyrie to recover her spirits. Robert looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. I did wonder what you might do with her. Her screams at seeing his head, well, it made my toes curl. I did not know that you had heard it. John sighed. My apologies, Your Grace. Think nothing of it, John. The whole Red Keep heard it, I think. He shook his head. John replied. She complains about Robin being so far away from her and demands his return. I will not have her anywhere near him. A raven came from Winterfell this morning. My son is free from the poison and is growing like a weed, Ned said. He said that young Robert is constantly asking questions and is learning to ride his own horse. He smiled fondly. I wish that I could see him. You soon will, Robert said with a smile. We are going to Winterfell. I made my mind up last night. We are reacting when we should be acting. This business with Baelish is all but complete now, as we sort out the finances. More word has come of unrest from this call that has gone out. We need to talk to Ned and we need to do it face to face. He won't come south, I can feel it. So we'll go north. To Winterfell. He thought about this for a long moment and then he nodded. Yes. And Winterfell was perfect for other reasons. You are moving the court there temporarily. I have a lot of catching up to do with Ned anyway, but we need answers, and quickly. He smiled slightly sourly. The nag won't like the fact that young Edric will be there before we get there, but I don't give a damn, as long as she doesn't have anything to do with him. Oh yes, I met another of my bastards the other day, in a smithy. Gendry by name. He's a big lad, the spitting image of me when I was that age. His eyes clouded over a moment. You know, I often wondered what kind of children Lyanna and I would have had. Gendry made me think of her for some reason. I dreamt of her again last night. The oddest dream. She was trying to tell me something, but the wind was howling about my ears. She was just as I remember her. Gods, but he wanted to tell Robert the truth about his true-born children, but that would have to wait until Winterfell, a place where Cersei and Jaime Lannister could be isolated, contained and brought to justice. And Winterfell was nicely isolated from the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister's reaction would be one of angry rejection of any claims of incest, followed by an icy demand to release his children and restore his grandchildren to the line of succession. If they handled it right, there just might not be a war. The problem would be Robert, who would probably fly into a rage and try and remove the heads of the incestuous couple with his sword. He made himself smile at Robert and was about to say something about young Gendry when he heard the puffing noise that heralded the arrival of Pycelle, who was clutching a rolled-up map under one arm and who looked as excited as he ever did. Your Grace. My Lord Hand. I have the answer. John stole a quick glance with Robert. The answer to what, Grand Maester? Pycelle had reached the table and was busy pinning the map down with weights. John watched him through narrowed eyes. He had his suspicions about Pycelle. There were times when the doddering fool faded away and a dangerously competent man loyal to the Lannisters shone through. At the moment he simply seemed very excited. I took most careful sightings of the exact direction that the statues of the Seven in the Great September were all turned to. Then I extrapolated the exact direction from points outside the Great September. He preened. It was most difficult. However, I have no small amount of skill in this matter and I was able to project a line thus. He placed a finger on the map and then gestured to a long red line that stretched north. They peered at the line. It misses Winterfell completely, Robert said grimly. Through the haunted forest, over the shivering sea, towards those hills there. So the Seven send us a warning against something along that line, north of the wall. It's never a good sign when men stare at maps with such grim faces, said a voice to one side. Varys had arrived, near silently on those slippered feet of his. Then he caught sight of what was on the map. Ah! The direction that the statues of the Seven were pointing towards. He peered at the map. Somewhere north of the wall, I see. Has this been shown to the High Septon? John asked. It has, my Lord Hand, Pycelle said quickly. I thought it best. There were a number of Septons there who were talking, somewhat wildly, of a holy war against Winterfell. They seemed most put out when I explained my findings. In great detail. Very loudly. Holy war, Robert said grimly. The faith militant. God's damn night. They seemed less enamored of their certainties after I talked to them, Pycelle said quietly. I was most thorough. They all stared at him and then Robert smiled. Nicely done, Grand Maester. Sadly, Varys said quietly, the High Septon needs to tell a lot more people as quickly as he can. There is word of more religious unrest elsewhere in the Seven Kingdoms. My little birds whisper to me that the Iron Islands are increasingly racked with conflict over this call, and there is word of unrest in the Riverlands, especially near Harrenhal and the God's Eye. Bugger. Robert spat the word furiously, before sitting in his seat. I'll have a word with the wretched man himself. What wretched man would this be? Renly asked as he walked in with Stannis next to him. The High Septon Jon sighed as he finally sat in his seat. He was more tired than he had first thought. There is dissension amidst the Septons. There should not be. Pycelle has traced where the statues of the Seven are facing now. The two Baratheons leant over the map. Ah. Renly finally said. How odd. He sat down. What does it mean? A number of people looked at each other in mutual confusion. We don't yet know, Jon said eventually. But as the statues are not looking at Winterfell, the Septons need to stop all this insane talk about fighting the heretics of the north. The faith of the First Men is alive and well south of the Neck, as we all know. The last thing we need is a religious war. Grunts of agreement and nods came from all around the table. Well said, Robert muttered. Now first things first. Jon and I have talked, and we intend to go north to Winterfell as soon as we can to talk to Ned Stark. Something is happening in the north, something related to this call and the legends of the others, and we need to find out what. Pycelle shifted in his chair and looked mulish at this mention of the others, and Jon was sure that he heard an annoyed whisper of northern legends. Harumph. Will you be moving the entire court to Winterfell? Stannis asked with a gleam in his eye that Jon understood perfectly. Cersei and I will be going, along with Jon. The children too. It's about time that they saw the north, plus I have a marriage alliance with the Starks in my mind. Joffrey could marry Ned's oldest daughter. It would strengthen links with the north at a time when, as we think now, the north needs as much support as possible. This was the first that he had heard of a possible marriage between Joffrey and Sansa, wasn't it? It made sense. However, Robert did not know what he did about Joffrey. He'd have to be told before they got to Winterfell. He looked at Stannis, who flickered an eyebrow at him. Yes, Stannis thought so too. But the kingdom cannot run itself when we are traveling, so we will leave the bulk of the small council here to keep an eye on things, especially if there is trouble in the realm. Varys, you and Pycelle will remain. Stannis, I need you to make sure that the navy is well prepared. We might be moving troops around by sea. Renly, how goes the unraveling of Baelish's books? Almost done, Renly said grimly. And some unpleasant things have emerged recently. It seems that Baelish had some fingers in some appalling places. He was a majority partner in an organization that had dealings with Slavers Bay. An appalled silence settled over the room, before Varys, his face racked with unexpected emotion, finally broke it. What? I'm afraid that you heard me correctly, Lord Varys, Renly replied solemnly. He had dealings with Slavers Bay. Meereen mostly. I should have hacked his miserable excuse for a head clean off his shoulders the moment I saw him, Stannis said through clenched teeth. The animal. Was he that greedy? He was, Renly acknowledged. The only good thing is that by liquidating his holdings the crown will make quite a bit of coin without profiting a single copper penny from the sale of slaves, I must stress. Unhappy nods greeted this around the table. God's damn that bloody man into the lowest hell that exists, Robert muttered. The man had no shame whatsoever. Varys, any news from you? Some, and mixed, your grace. There is, as I said, trouble in the Iron Islands, primarily religion-based. Oh, and the Company of the Rose has left Pentos, bound, I am informed, for White Harbor. The entire company. It is most unusual. They are drawn home, as their leader, the Stone, said to fight the others. Then he coughed delicately. They have been joined by another exile. Ser Jorah Mormont. Robert stared at the eunuch incredulously. Mormont. The idiot from Bear Island who Ned discovered had sold poachers into slavery so that he could keep his Hightower wife in silks. And also the man who has been sending regular reports from SOs about all manner of events there, including a number of things that allowed us to stop various unpleasantnesses. He is the man who discovered that the Dothraki were moving eastwards for some mysterious reason. And he was the man who has been keeping an eye on the Targaryens. Are they still in Pentos? Robert barked. Yes, your grace, in the mansion of one of the magisters there, one Illyrio Mapatis, a man who I know. Apparently it turns out that there is potential dissension there. It appears that Viserys Targaryen did not tell his sister about the nature of their father. Namely the truth about the deaths of the Starks in the Red Keep. And other things. Robert snorted with contempt. Why does that not surprise me? It also seems that Viserys Targaryen has become somewhat obsessed with a dragon egg in his possession. Various eyeballs swiveled. Will it hatch? Stannis asked. Varys simpered slightly. I have been reliably informed that it will not. It had better not, Robert rumbled. Anything else? Willers Tyrell appears to be taking a greater role in the running of the Reach, your grace. It appears that he and his grandmother are taking steps to sideline his father. I had heard something similar, Renly said gruffly. Loras Tyrell has been recalled to Highgarden. Jon looked at the youngest Baratheon out of the corner of his eye. He looked perfectly composed. Interesting. It might be refreshing to deal with a competent person in charge of the Reach, Stannis muttered. As opposed to that fat idiot. There was a loud drumming noise from Robert's hand as his fingers hammered against the desk. Is this linked to the call? Given the tale of Willers Tyrell's sleepwalking and use of a sledgehammer in finding a hidden room in Highgarden, more than likely, your grace. Another reason to go north to Winterfell, Robert muttered. Anything else? There is the matter of a new master of coin, your grace. Jon asked. Oh gods. Yes, I've been looking at the suggestions from various people. Cersei's list might as well have had Lannister written all the way through it. Sir Harris Swyft. Giles Rosby. Good gods. Alistair Florent. Stannis muttered. What about him? There was a pause as Robert pondered this. Old, rich and clever. Ambitious too, but not so much that he'd be as mad as Baelish. Not a bad idea, brother. I will think on it most carefully. Anything else? Various heads were shaken and then Robert stood up. Good. Renly, Stannis, come with me. I need to spar again and I will kick your asses around the sparring ground, brothers. Renly grinned at his oldest brother and even Stannis cracked the slightest of smiles before they vanished off. Varys bowed and left on silent feet, whilst Pycelle rolled his map up and then hobbled off. Jon sighed as he got to his feet and stared at the room. Winterfell. It would be a long trip. By road or by sea to White Harbor. He'd think about the logistics later. He picked up his papers and then strode out. It wasn't until he turned the third corner that he felt a frisson of alarm. He was being watched. But by whom? Who would dare? He looked about. No one. Imagination. He strode on. Damn it, why did they have to have meetings in such a remote place? Paranoia. He sensed rather than saw the dagger as it flashed out of the shadows and was just about able to turn fast enough that it glanced off a rib instead of plunging into his stomach. He groaned with pain as the blade sliced through robes, skin and flesh and he felt the blood start to flow down his side. One hand flailed out at the hand that held the attacking dagger and he felt the blade with a finger. More blood. Whoever was attacking him didn't know his business and he heard panting to one side. He pulled his left hand down to try and pull out his own dagger as he pushed against his attacker. The corridor was poorly lit and all he could see was a cloaked and hooded figure. He could feel his blood thundering through his veins. Too old, he thought, too old. The dagger came down again and he barely deflected it as it sank into his side. Agony flared and he grunted in pain. Only then did his attacker speak and the words broke him with shock. For Petter. Die, old man. You horrible old man. Lysa. It was Lysa. His own wife. Why? Why was she doing this? Shock paralyzed him and then the dagger came down again. This time he got a hand to it and pushed it to one side, whilst jabbing almost by instinct with his own. Lysa groaned in pain as his dagger sliced her arm, but her own dagger had hit his ribs yet again. His vision was blurring, he was weakening fast. She kicked at him then and he felt his own legs wobble and then he fell. There was blood on his hands and somehow on his face and he wondered where his dagger had gone to. Lysa. Why was Lysa doing this? And then he saw the boot moving towards his face. He turned his head just enough so that it crashed into his forehead and not his jaw. And then darkness fell. Lysa. She hurried down the corridor, trying not to sob with pain. The wretched old man had hurt her with his dagger, a long slash on her arm that was bleeding and which hurt. She sobbed for a moment and then she remembered what it had felt like to see him die in front of her. She'd kicked him in the head twice, as hard as she could, and then pain had hit her. As she scurried down the corridor she wrapped a piece of cloth around the wound and hid it under her cloak. There was so much to do. She had a long way to go. Once she was safe in the Eyrie, once she had Sweet Robin back, then things would be as they should be. He needed her. Only she could make sure that he got his medicine, only she could make sure that he was protected. He was a delicate boy, her delicate boy, and only she could take care of him. The medicine helped. Petter had promised her that after she'd asked him for it. Another wave of rage and grief shook her. Petter. How could be gone? How? Why had the old man killed him? All those lies about money. Petter would never steal. He was an amazing man. He should have been Sweet Robin's father, not that horrible old man. She slipped down another corridor and along a passage. She could smell fresh air and then she was outside. Her party was waiting for her there, men and women that she knew could be relied upon. Petter had found some of them and she wondered for a moment where he was. Pulling up the hood of her cloak she got into the nondescript carriage. To the veil she snapped at her attendant, who bowed wordlessly. At once. The reins were flicked and the horses started to first walk and then trot. Back to the Eyrie. And then a raven to her idiot sister in Winterfell demanding the immediate return of Sweet Robin. With him at her side, well, they could be together at the Eyrie, and no one would ever bother them. Ever. They would be together. She pressed the cloth tighter against the wound on her arm. Damn that old man. She'd killed him though. He was dead. A giggle emerged from her mouth. Who could she marry now? Perhaps Petter, now that she was free of the old man. Wait, no. Petter was gone. A sob ripped through her. Damn that old man. She sat there, confused for a moment. Who was dead again? Wait, they both were. The carriage rattled across the flagstones. And then they were out of the Red Keep. She was free. Free of everyone. But she had to get her Sweet Robin back. He needed her. She was his mother. Only she knew how important his medicine was. Robb. He was pale and trembling as he watched the great direwolf keen softly as she whelped. A lot of recent events had been, well, he felt as if he had started something that would have a different outcome to the world that had been in existence at the moment of his death. But the arrival of the direwolves was something else. It meant that time had caught up with him. It meant that the months ahead might see the fate of Winterfell balanced as if on a knife edge. And then the first direwolf pup. Despite the wetness from the birthing fluids and the odd bit of blood, he knew who it was at once. Grey Wind. His Grey Wind. He felt his hands shake as he looked at the trembling little form, which was being nudged and licked clean by his mother. Yes, it was him. His beloved direwolf. The others seemed to follow swiftly, even though he knew that it took longer than that. The memories were too strong, the emotions too heavy. So many images thundered through his mind. The news that father had been arrested. The calling of the banners. The terrible day when the news had come that father had been executed by that little shit Joffrey. Whispering Wood. Oxcross. Theon's betrayal. And then, the twins. The place where he had died. He was shaking harder now, and then he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see father standing there with a look of deep sympathy. Memories. He replied with a wry smile. Memories. Terrible ones and worse. Understandable, father said softly. So which one is yours? He pointed straight at Grey Wind, who was sniffing the air, his eyes obviously still shut. Grey Wind. And the others? Lady. Nymeria. Summer. Shaggy Dog. Ghost. Father smiled. Shaggy Dog. Rukun was a bit literal. He's still just a child. And then the world seemed to stop still and shake, because all of a sudden the direwolf was shaking again and keening, and then another pup entered the world. Robb stared in shock. Another direwolf pup. What was this? It was a little smaller than Ghost, who he'd always thought was the runt of the litter, and was small and light grey. That's new, he said dazedly. There wasn't another one. Father stared at the little direwolf as it was roughly cleaned by its mother. The old gods are speaking to us again. I wonder who this one is for. He didn't know. And that both challenged him and scared him. The future was in flux. Shireen. Maester Cresson was in what he often described as being a brown study as she watched him sit in his usual chair in the great hall of Dragonstone. She had always wondered what a brown study was, and he had always smiled and said that it merely meant deep in thought. So it was with a little bit of reluctance that she approached him, the book in both hands. He had told her to tell him when she has finished with her translation efforts, but she still didn't want to break into whatever it was that he was thinking about. Maester Cresson. He looked up, almost startled. Oh, your pardon, my dear. I was lost in thought. In a brown study again. He smiled fondly at her. Indeed. How can I help you? She placed the book on a small table. I've finished it. Maester Cresson blinked at her. Already? She nodded. It was very interesting. I see, the old man said as he leant back in his chair. And what were your conclusions? She sat down carefully as she ordered her thoughts with equal care. Is it bad of me to be glad that the doom of Valyria happened and that those people don't exist anymore? His eyebrows rose a little. Why do you say that? They were unpleasant. Slavery. Working people to death in their mines. Conquering places to get more slaves and more wealth. Killing each other to try and gain power. Incest. I wouldn't want to live there, not the way that they were. Our Maester Cresson said with twinkling eyes, but if you'd been brought up in old Valyria, then you would have been brought up with their values and you'd have thought them perfectly normal. She thought about this. I'd rather not imagine that. I know that they built great things. Valyria. The freehold. Dragonstone, here. But they built it all on blood. He looked at her and she could see that he was trying not to show too much pride. Very interesting, my lady. You have a knack of seeing through things to the underlying truth. Very interesting indeed. She smiled impishly at him. Thank you. Then she paused. Maester Cresson. The Valyrians built Dragonstone, but what was here first? The book said that they conquered it from the Lords of the Narrow Sea, but what did they want with the place? And who dug all the tunnels? The Maester said, now that's a matter of ancient history. Let us consult the records. And with that he stood and led the way to what had to be one of her favorite places in the world, the part of the library that held the oldest of the books. He pored over the serried ranks of books with the titles picked out in flaking gold leaf, before finally selecting one. Let's see how you are with High Old Valyrian. She took the proffered book and opened it carefully on a reading desk. Oh, this was old. And the writing. She squinted at it as she shifted his mind into the correct frame to read such an old script. Oh. This was ancient. And then, the Lord Valerys, did fall upon the Sea Lord. Yes, Sea Lord Saril Todd named that, and did kill a great many of his men and did seize the island which he did recall. No, rename, Dragonstone. And he did inspect why other old tunnels and ask who had delved. No, dug them, and was told that the first men had mined them for dragon glass. She looked up. This script makes my eyes hurt. Good. Good that you can read it, that is, not good that your eyes hurt. He sighed and took the book off her. That's the only reference I've ever been able to find. Obsidian was mined here by the first men. The oldest tunnels are very old indeed. But there are no carvings in them. No names. And who is to say what was where Dragonstone was when the Valyrians used their magics to build it? He ran a hand over his face and Shireen looked at him worriedly. Maester Cresson, what's wrong? You've been worried for days now. He smiled at her again. Concerned, Lady Shireen. Not worried. Just concerned. The Citadel has said that magic has returned and that every Maester must watch for signs of it. Especially in a place like this. Built with magic. Old, Valyrian magic. I have been looking all over this place. Asking people about feelings. Dreams. And then there is this. He held up a small piece of paper. From Winterfell. Asking about how much obsidian we can ship to White Harbor. As it was sent in the old days. She took the message and looked at it carefully. Ah. What should we do? He shrugged. Mining obsidian is, well, I've never known any obsidian miners, so I do not know how easy, or hard, it is. But I do know that in the lowest and oldest of the tunnels there are hundreds of rotted sacks filled with obsidian. Thousands of pieces that could be sent north. I have sent word to your father, Lord Stannis, but I have already given orders for some of the obsidian to at least be placed in new sacks. She thought about this. Why would they need obsidian? This question caused him to pinch the bridge of his nose with finger and thumb, a sign that he was curious and worried. I have a suspicion. Obsidian has certain properties in the use of magic, or so it is written. And there is another record. He picked up another book and opened it. This is a history of the Stormlands that I brought with me from Storm's End. And, there. Read that. She looked down at the faint script. It's very faded, Maester Cresson. I'm having it copied out in a new book. She peered at it. Ye oldest carving upon the wall is that of a pledge, glitter glass sent to ye Stark in Winterfell, in memory, warning and protection of ye ancient enemy. Shireen looked up. Memory, warning and protection. What does that mean? He pulled at his nose once more. I think it is something about the obsidian itself. I have been reading many of the older books. He peered at her severely. Ones that are dangerous in the wrong hands and which will not be read by you. Humph. She smiled slightly. But. Don't tell me that your High Valyrian is better than mine, either. He followed this with a slight smile. Yours is quite good. But on a more serious note, the books I talking about are indeed dangerous to one of your age. She sighed and nodded. I shall start on the next book you gave me then. Patchfist has been very subdued of late and Mother has gone to King's Landing to be with Father. She turned a bit pink after that letter from Father. Odd. Maester Cresson had turned slightly pink as well. Your father has had a slight revelation apparently. I wouldn't wonder too hard at that. It's complicated. This was odd, but she nodded. Then she paused. Oh, and you wanted to know if people had any odd dreams? Then his gaze sharpened. Have you had any? I think so. She paused to recall the details exactly. It was last night. I was in a forest of odd trees. Weirwood trees, I think. And it was winter, there was snow everywhere. A man who looked like a thinner version of Uncle Robert was running after a woman with dark brown hair and grey eyes, who was being pulled by I don't know exactly what. She was trying to tell him something, I know that much. And there was something else. Someone else, I think. It was scary. White, with white hair and blue eyes, like stars. All of a sudden Maester Cresson was very white himself. Shireen, he said with real concern in his voice, you need to tell me if you ever have such a dream again. Tyrion. Tyrion peered at the book and then pursed his lips a little. Interesting. The Night Fort had a fascinating history. And appeared in most of the North's nastier folk tales. The one about the Night King, the one from the Night's Watch, not the king of the others, was a particularly nasty one. It could possibly be explained away as a man who had somehow turned against everything that he should have been protecting. Such things happened. And perhaps instead of a female other did such a thing even exist. There were accounts that perhaps she had been from a Barrowlands settlement. The oddest feeling stole over him at that point. When he realized what it was, he put his book down, sighed heavily, and then looked about the room. A grave lad with hair that was almost red-brown was staring at him as if he was committing his appearance to memory. Oh. It was Lord Reed's son. "Can I help you? You're Hojan Reed, isn't it?" Wait, Ned Stark had said something about this boy, hadn't he? He racked his brain for a moment. "I," said the boy, in a voice as grave as his face. "You are Tyrion Lannister." He went back to staring at him. This was unnerving, and he shifted a little in his seat. "As I said, can I help you?" Hojan Reed tilted his head a little. "I had a dream of a small man who became a larger one. I think that the man was you." He peered at the boy. "A dream?" The boy nodded. "Father says that I have the green sight." The green sight? Shock roiled through him. Oh, yes, this was the boy with the green sight. Prophecy. He swallowed. All of a sudden he wanted to run away and hide under the nearest bed. He'd already had one northerner get possessed by the old gods and tell him to do something. He wasn't sure if he could take any more prophecies. "And what did you dream about me?" The boy tilted his head to one side again. "That you grew larger in spirit, with the help of someone." "Who was that someone?" "I don't know. Someone thought dead but was not." He thought about this for a moment. It didn't sound terribly reassuring. "I see." "No," said the boy. "You don't. But you will." And then he turned and walked away. "I suppose," Tyrion muttered to himself after the boy had gone, "that I'll grow after stepping into a magic mirror or something at the night fort." He thought about the look on Father's face if he returned as tall as Jaime, and then chuckled, before returning to his book. He spent a very interesting hour or so reading through the book, before finally closing it and sighing. He was going to one of the oldest castles on the wall. And also the most infamous. Why? Well, that bit was a tad nebulous. A memory gnawed at him and he bit his lip for a moment, before sighing and then pulling out the message that he'd written earlier. The problem with sending messages by Raven was that they were, by necessity, somewhat limited. He wanted to send a massive book back to Casterly Rock, but that would take a team of specially trained ravens to carry it, and sadly such a team did not exist. He could have sent an ordinary letter by messenger, but that would have been slower than a raven. So a raven it was. Perhaps he could devise some kind of code, or condensed script. It was an interesting idea. But first this had to be sent. He got down off his chair and then stumped his way to Lewin's office. He found the old maester there, working through his mound of books. He had to admit that the maester knew his business. He had a huge amount of information at his fingertips and what Tyrion knew to be a giant appetite for more. He liked the man enormously. "Can I help you, Lord Tyrion?" Lewin asked as he looked up from his perusal of his own book. "You can indeed, Maester Lewin," Tyrion sighed. "I have a message to send to my father in Casterly Rock, so I require a raven." He held up the piece of paper with a sigh. Well, the die was cast now. He was committed. He just had to hope that father wouldn't misconstrue things and think up some kind of plot about the threat from the north. At least he was dealing with father and not Cersei. She'd think all kinds of things about this, all of them dead wrong. Robert. He was going mad waiting. He hated it. When Cersei had given birth to the children, he'd always been off doing other things rather than wait. Especially when there were maesters involved. They always hemmed and hawed and sucked their teeth and then looked worried when he waved a fist under their noses. Sparring hadn't helped. Normally it did, but his mind had been too busy to handle it correctly and he'd gone through the motions with a visibly worried Sir Barristan. Pacing didn't work either. He'd paced all over the Red Keep and now had a blister. So now he had thrown himself onto a horse, told Renly curtly to send a message to the docks if the maesters emerged from that damn room, and then he'd booted the horse into a trot, out the gates and down the hill, Selmy following him. He couldn't die. Jon just couldn't. He couldn't imagine a world without that wise old man. The docks were busy. Busier than normal, now he came to think about it. Then he sighed. Of course. Jon's orders for the move north to Winterfell. He smiled sadly. Well, even if he lived he'd be too weak to go with him. The horizon caught his eye and he glared at it. He had to confess that he didn't like the sea much. He had been at Storm's End when Windproud had sunk in that storm. Right in front of his eyes. Taking his parents with it. Old memories crowded through his mind. His parents. Gods, he missed them so much at times. But it had been Jonarin who had all but brought him up. He'd been a father to him. Stefan Baratheon, well, he'd been a good friend to the Mad King. Before he became as mad as he had in his last years. He heard hooves behind him and he closed his eyes for a long moment and then opened them again before turning around. Sir Davos Seaworth was dismounting. He nodded seriously to Selmy, who nodded back and then approached and went to one knee, getting up again at Robert's curt wave of a hand. News from the Red Keep. Nay, your grace. The Gold Cloaks have searched the city. Lady Arryn is not in King's Landing. She must have been in one of the many parties that left the city that day. You know how large King's Landing is, your grace. Dozens of parties leave every day. However, ravens have been sent to every town in the area. We'll find her, your grace. He nodded abruptly and then brooded again. It was definitely her. It was her knife on the floor, with her own husband's blood on it. And judging by his own knife, with blood on it as well, and the fact that Lady Arryn was seen with a cut to her arm, it can only have been her. A silence fell. Seaworth coughed. I fear it was because of Baelish, your grace. He sighed and then nodded. I. Damn the man. Damn that wretched bloody man. Even dead he's a threat. He looked back up at Sir Davos. How goes your work with the Gold Cloaks? The Onion Knight pulled a slight face. Slow but steady, your grace. It's still early days and the best thing that I can say of Janos Slynt is that he left a trail of slime everywhere. Including his own execution, Robert muttered as he remembered the filthy mess that the wretched man had left when he was dragged to the block. Damn him as well. But I am making some progress. He shifted a little. I shall return to the Red Keep, your grace. If the Maesters have any news I shall send word at once. He bowed awkwardly and then mounted and left. Robert glared again at the horizon and then paced up and down the docks. And then he heard the sound of metal on metal and a puff-puff of bellows. Looking over to one side he could see smoke rising from a chimney that appeared to be attached to a chandler's. A memory tickled his mind and he strode over to it. Startled men watched him approach and tugged their forelocks in some cases, bowing in others. Yes, the boy was there, at the forge. Gendry was frowning at a piece of red-hot metal that he had been pounding on with a hammer. He started when he caught sight of Robert and then bowed clumsily. Don't me lad finish working your piece of metal, he said gruffly. He had to say, curious about how good the lad was. Take a break after that though. I need to talk to you. Gendry looked at him carefully and then nodded and went back to the anvil, where he shaped the cooling metal with a few deft strokes. He peered at it again, put the metal back in the forge for a few minutes and then pulled it out again and hammered with what Robert could tell was carefully applied force. It took skill to do that. He was making, a marlin spike. He paused. Of all the daft things he'd picked up from the Greyjoy rebellion that had somehow stuck in his brain. The boy looked at the piece of metal critically, nodded decisively and then placed it in the correct quenching bucket, before carefully putting everything in the correct place and then turning to Robert. I'm done, your grace. He nodded and then jerked a thumb at the nearest key. Need to talk to you. The lad nodded and then followed him. When they reached a bollard he sighed and then turned to face his bastard son. You probably have questions about your mother. This brought a flush to Gendry's face, along with a choppy nod. I do, Emlor, I mean your grace. He sat on the bollard and sighed. She was a pretty thing, your mother. Her smile could light up a room. And lift your heart. She was funny and cleverer than she appeared. Gendry scuffed a boot on the planks of the dock. I don't take after her much then. You can swing a hammer with a lot of skill. A fool can't do that. Don't be hard on yourself, lad. He sighed and then scratched at the back of his head. And you take after your father a lot. The lad stared at him. My father. Did you know him as well, your grace? This was embarrassing. And harder than he ever thought it would be. Yes. In a matter of speaking. He stood up and ran a hand over his face. Then he looked the lad in the eye. There's a reason that Lord Arryn and Lord Stannis came to see you. You look a lot like me. That's because I'm your father. Gendry stared at him for a long moment, looking as if that marlinspike had walloped him on the back of the head. Pardon, your grace. He said the words in a low, astonished voice. He placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. You heard me right, lad. And I'm sorry. Your mother never sent me word. I didn't know that she was with child. That she'd had you. He looked at his feet for a moment and then winced a little at the fact that he had to peer over his gut to do so. He had a lot of work to do. Then he looked back up again. But I know that you exist now, so I can make up for some things. The lad was pale and trembling and he didn't blame him. It was a lot to take in. After a long moment the lad asked, What will happen to me now? He said it in a dazed voice. I try and make sure that my bloody scold of a wife doesn't try and kill you, was the thing that he couldn't say to the lad, so he didn't. The history of the Black Fires was long and complicated and bloody awful, and not something to be hinted at, so he didn't. You know how to swing a hammer, he found himself saying eventually. Have you ever held a war hammer? Gendry shook his head. Perhaps it's time you learned. And not here. He thought carefully for a moment. He couldn't send the lad to Winterfell. Edric was on his way there as well and the scold would get suspicious. Hells, given the nature of this fucking city there was probably someone watching him right now and compiling a report, for Varys or the scold, or Pycelle for all he knew. Dragonstone. Stannis might not like that. Right. He knew where now. I'm sending you to Storm's End. The place that your ancestors built. Get back to work now, but get your things ready. There'll be a ship going there today, I think. Your uncle Renly's sending messages to his new steward there. The lad gaped at a bit at this but then rallied. But my work here can be done by someone else. Who's your overseer? Master Turnbull. Over there. Let me have a word with him. Now back to work. The lad strode off and he watched him go with a slight smile. Gods, it was like looking at a younger version of himself. Then he walked over to have a word with Turnbull, who had been watching them with a look of uncertainty on his face, which vanished after Robert snapped out a string of orders. He walked back to the docks and stared out at the sea again with a different kind of scowl. You did what you needed to do for family. How had he forgotten that? He pulled a face. Too drunk and fat and full of food perhaps in the past. Well, by the gods, no longer. He mounted his horse and vowed to get the rest of this fat off him, if he had to spar all day and all night. And then he saw the messenger as he rode up in a cloud of dust. It was a Baratheon man, who reined in hard. Your Grace, the man gasped, word from the Red Keep. Lord Arryn will live. He grinned fiercely. Good man. And then he spurred his horse and galloped up the hill, feeling more alive than he had for years. Chapter 14. Chapter text. Kevan. He drew rein in the courtyard and then looked about. The place was abuzz with messengers, with the odd raven coming and going, and he looked about quizzically. What was going on? Well, whatever it was, it had been enough to recall him at once from his long-planned visit to Feast Fires. Tywin's message had been abrupt even for him, just return as soon as possible, so he had. He dismounted and walked over to the doorway, where a servant was standing with a bowl of water and a cloth, and he quickly washed the dust of the road off his face and hands, before nodding at the servant and then striding off down the corridor that eventually led to Tywin Solar. There was an almost constant stream of messengers going backwards and forwards out of the room, and he watched them with bemusement and no small amount of dread. But then he thought about it. If his brother was taking the Westerlands to war, then why hadn't he seen any soldiers on the roads that he'd ridden along? Striding into the Solar, he saw Tywin almost hidden from sight behind a mound of books. Odd. They were ledgers and account books. His brother was perusing the books, glaring at a series of messages in one hand and scribbling messages with the other, messages that he was giving out to the messengers. When he saw Kevan, he grunted. About damn time. Then he looked at the messengers. Get out. Wait to be allowed back in. They left, quickly, closing the door behind the last one. What's happened? Why all the books? Kevan asked as he sank into a chair and suppressed a groan as various muscles twinged. Tywine sat back and glowered at him. A message from King's Landing. Robert Baratheon needs a new master of coin. Petyr Baelish is dead. He frowned a little. Was he ill? No. He was arrested and then all but executed by Jon Arryn. He felt his eyebrows fly up. Arrested? For what? Peculation. Thieving from the crown, Tywine growled. Thieving from everyone. And thieving from me. The last words were shouted in a guttural roar of fury that made the room quiver. Kevan looked at his brother worriedly. He did what? Tywine calmed himself with a visible effort of will, before standing and striding over to a small table, where he poured 2 goblets of wine, one of which he handed over to Kevan, who sipped it carefully. The ravens came 3 days ago, Tywine muttered as he sat at his chair again. Messages, all. Baelish was arrested, then he was dead. And the list of his crimes is a long one. He stole from the crown. From the Iron Bank as well. And, of course, from me. A brief and savage smile crossed his face, and Kevan realized that his own mouth was hanging open. Ambitious wasn't he? He stole from the Iron Bank. Was the man mad? I suspect, Tywine growled after sipping from his own goblet, that he reached the point where he stole because he could. After so many years of not being found out, of diverting coin into his own pockets and then his trousers and then finally his boots, I think that he threw caution out of the window. Kevan winced at his brother's savage tone. You said all but executed. How did he die? And who has replaced him? Tywine's eyes glittered with malevolence. I did not think that Jon Arryn had it in him to be creative. I was wrong. He sentenced Baelish to trial by combat, in heavy armor. Very heavy armor. A shame, because his opponent Arryn's champion was the sea itself. He had him dropped through a hole in the dock. His head is now on a spike in the Red Keep. He frowned again. No replacement has yet been named. My idiot daughter has sent me this. He waved another message. She thinks that we can use the crown's debt to us to force Arryn to appoint someone pliable to the Lannister cause. This seemed like a good thing, but why was, He looked at the books. What did Baelish do with the money he stole? Tywine nodded approvingly. Finally, someone else sees it. Very good, Kevan. Baelish took the coin and invested it. He was a clever man. A man who realized that if you have a big bag of money hidden under your bed, you are not rich, you are merely a hoarder. A rich man is one that lets the coin work for him. And Baelish was rich and clever. Foolhardy as well, but that's an aside. He used the coin to buy interests in all the 7 kingdoms. Counting houses. Trading posts. Trading companies. Shipping companies. Smithies. Masons. Lumberyards. Mines. Brothels. The list is a long one, as is the list of the false names he used to buy them with. He held up a small sheath of messages. This is the latest. I have been using it to find all the properties and holdings that Baelish had bought in the Westerlands. Rage filled his voice again. Which were many. The records show the wretched man had tendrils all over the place. All over the Westerlands. He was buying up properties under my nose. And he was investing it. Which makes things worse. Kevan frowned, and then a lamp of understanding was lit in his mind. Making what he bought more valuable. His brother nodded again. Yes. And Arryn has written to say that we can appropriate what Baelish owned in the Westerlands. How honorable of him. Oh, and of course any such appropriations will of course be set against the crown's debt to us. So when my idiot daughter writes to me of using that debt as leverage, what leverage? What debt? His mouth was hanging open again. He closed it with a snap. Baelish's properties are worth that much. Oh yes. Baelish chose well. Invested wisely. We will reap the benefit. In fact, we will profit mightily. Which we will have to thank the crown for. Clever of Arryn. Cleverer than I thought he was capable of. He picked up a letter and then threw it to one side. Kevan could see Circe's characteristically flamboyant signature at the bottom of it. Tywine pinched the bridge of his nose and then sighed slightly. "Why is it," he asked softly, "that the only one of my children with even half a brain is the one that I cannot stand to look at sometimes? Circe is spiteful and not as clever as she thinks she is. Jaime thinks ridiculous things about honor and hones remarks that he regards as being clever. Tyrion at least uses his brain at times." "You are too hard on Tyrion," Kevan said softly. "He has a brilliant mind. I see you scowl a little, but Tyrion is clever in a way that few others are. He drinks too much and frequents whores. He would do less of that if you gave him something meaningful to do." He paused. He was on delicate ground here. "You should have made him your heir years ago." Tywine stiffened, as his face worked slightly. "I am considering the matter." Which was the same thing that he had said on the matter in question for years. There was a moment of silence and then Tywine leant forwards with a sigh and started looking through the books again. "Well now, I must continue. Now that you are back I have a job for you. The one place nearby that I have so far not appropriated is in Lannisport. Baelish had a factor there, a man with something of a reputation for violence and duplicity. I want you to take 100 men and arrest the man before he has a chance to falsify any of his records. If we are to profit from the fall of Baelish, I wish to profit in full. This will take care, tact and the appropriate use of the threat of violence. So I need your talents." Kevan stood up. "A compliment, brother. I'm touched. An accurate description, nothing more. Let me know when it's done." And then he gestured at the door. "I need messengers. Apparently Baelish owned property near Golden Tooth. I would know where and why. And Circe's message is to be ignored. She will soon realize the truth of the matter. If she bothers thinking about it, that is." Kevan winced slightly but then nodded and strode from the room, leaving the door open for the messengers to re-enter. Well. It seemed that he had a little more traveling to do that day. Ned. The direwolf was nursing the pups as he looked into the expanded store. The little mewling bundles didn't look like much, but based on what Robb had told him of Grey Wind's exploits on the battlefield they could be formidable fighters. They'd been suckling on the direwolf's teats earlier and now they were a slowly subsiding heap of sleeping figures. He smiled down at them. He'd assign to the children in a few days, once they were a little older. The issue of that final pup was still niggling at him, but he thought he had the answer. The great head of the direwolf swung towards him and he once again engaged in one of those staring competitions with the creature that he'd been having recently. It was almost as if it could read his mind at times and then gave him pause for thought. "The blood of wargs runs through my veins," he said softly. "But how did they do it? How can a man swap minds with a wolf?" The direwolf tilted its head to one side slightly, before making an odd huff of noise, before carefully standing. It nosed the pups, sniffed at them and then padded over to the doorway and looked into his eyes before looking to one side. He also turned his head and saw Jory Castle hurrying towards him. "My lord." "What is it, Jory?" "Horsemen approaching. They bear the banner of the Dread Fort." "Ah. Roose Bolton. Admit him. And have you seen Robb anywhere?" Jory pointed at Robb, who was sparring with Jon and Theon again. "Good. Robb." He followed the roar with a wave of his hand to join him. His eldest son stepped back and stared at him, before throwing his practice sword at Theon, who almost dropped it, and running towards him. "Father. I need you to go to my solar and get the fist. Clear your head at the same time, because Roose Bolton has arrived." Robb's eyes flickered and he set his jaw a little, but he then nodded shortly and took off at a run. Good. The lad had a good mind for such things. He sighed and then set his own jaw. This would be an interesting conversation. Then he paused. The direwolf was walking by his side. He looked at it for a moment and then shrugged a little. Yes, that might help. Roose. He had to admit to being a little nervous as he rode in through the main gates of Winterfell. There was a lot riding on this. The future of the Boltons was at stake. It was just him and Domeric now, no other Boltons lived. Oh, There were some cousins here and there that might make a claim if he and Domeric were both killed right there and then, but they didn't bear the name. He dismounted and then he froze, just for a heartbeat. Ned Stark was walking towards him with a direwolf at his side. A huge direwolf. He'd read Domeric's letter about the night the creature arrived several times, mostly with bemusement. It sounded almost too bizarre for words. He no longer thought that. The direwolf walked next to Ned Stark as if it was his protector, as if he had raised it from a pup. But it was full grown. On the other side stood young Robb Stark, who normally looked like a Tully but who today looked like a stone-faced image of his father. He schooled his face as he stepped forwards to meet them, before going down on one knee, his awestruck men following his example. "Lord Stark, House Bolton stands ready to face the long night. Command us. Rise, Lord Bolton." He stood. Ned Stark was looking at him, with a look on his face that seemed to be concealing something. "Welcome back to Winterfell, Roose." It was only then that he saw the huge mace at Ned Stark's waist, and he thought furiously for a moment. What was that? Where was the usual sword he bore? "Thank you, Ned," he replied as they clasped forearms. Whatever it was Ned Stark was thinking, the look on his face had gone. "I think that we have a lot to discuss." "We do indeed. But perhaps not with my friend here." He turned to look at the direwolf, which tilted her head at him and then huffed a little. Before it padded off back to wherever it was going to, it stared at him, a long and intent stare. A stare that made him nervous for some reason. "My solar, I think," Ned Stark said, and then led the way there. As they walked, Roose looked about and at one point caught sight of Domeric in the far distance, talking to a small boy on a horse. "Why the new mace?" Roose asked as they entered the room. Then he paused. There was a doorway to one side that he didn't remember from previous visits to Winterfell, and every table seemed to be covered in books. Ned Stark pulled it out and hefted it in front of him, and as he did, by some trick of the light, Roose seemed to see a flash of red in his eyes for a heartbeat or two. "It's not new at all," he said quietly. "It's old. Very old. This is the ancestral weapon of the Starks. This is the Fist of Winter." Roose stared at it in disbelief. No. No, that was impossible. That had been lost, long centuries ago, hadn't it? No Stark had borne it in. How long again? He cleared his throat. Truly. He hated the way that his voice seemed to catch a little. He was Roose Bolton. He made people nervous with the quietness and intenseness of his own voice. He did not get all shaken up by the presence of the weapon that the Starks had once wielded in battle against the others, and also the Bolton kings of old. It was the weapon that had united the North. And it was a symbol of Stark's authority. Truly, Ned Stark said with a certain amount of quiet intent. He placed it to one side and then sat at his desk, before leaning back and fixing him with stare that made his skin crawl for a moment. "We need to talk, Roose. As you know, your son Domeric has asked for the hand of my daughter Sansa. I have to tell you that I considered the matter most carefully before giving my consent. Especially given this other matter. The one involving your bastard son, Ramsay Snow." Roose nodded shortly. "A bad business, that." Ned Stark leaned forwards a little. "More than bad, a crime in every sense of the word. His actions were unforgivable." He made himself unclench his fists a little. He was mad. He stated the words simply, but with the feeling that he was treading on very thin ice all of a sudden, that there was a lot at stake right at this instant. "I found his journal in his lodgings. If it can be called that. No, it had been a collection of mad scribblings. He wrote out his plans. He hated Domeric, wanted to kill him if they ever met. He envied him his position as my true-born son. He resented me as well. He wanted the Dread Fort. And wanted to be powerful." He said the word carefully. "Oh yes, Ramsay wanted power, all right. And the crown of the Bolton kings. Mad, but a dreamer. And dreams like that were very dangerous, especially on a day like today." Ned Stark looked at him, his eyes searching Roose's face for something in it, and then he leant back again. "Well. He is dead now. So the circumstances of his life should be laid to one side. Such as the matter of his birth. Part of him wanted to snap that the Honorable Ned Stark had a bastard of his own, but the more sensible rest of him buried that part hastily. So instead he just nodded shortly. Roose Ned Stark continued, I wrote to Lord Redfort about Domeric, asking his opinion on him. I would have done the same of anyone who sought to marry one of my daughters. He replied that Domeric was a good and honorable young man. Perhaps more Redfort than Dreadfort, Roose thought wryly and then buried that thought as well. He still had that feeling of thin ice under his feet. Yes, Domeric was a good lad. I am glad to hear it. You should be, for it was part of what convinced me to allow the marriage. The other was the fact that Domeric swore an oath that he would never harm or betray Sansa. And he swore it on the Fist of Winter, of his own volition. I did not suggest it at all and was surprised when he did so. But he still did it. Shock and then nausea roiled through him. Domeric had sworn on the Fist. Something must have broken through the impassive look he usually wore on his face, because Ned Stark raised an eyebrow at him. He mulled it over and then replied. There are tales about the Fist of Winter, Ned. About the import of oaths sworn on it. He hesitated for a moment. A Bolton once swore an oath on it and then later broke his word. He died inside a month. A second Stark eyebrow was raised and then lowered. Well then. Domeric knows the potential cost. I am satisfied though. Are you? He thought very hard and very fast. Here was the danger point, the moment that he had been thinking about. His son wanted to tie himself to House Stark in such a way that would make it very hard to unbind. And the news of the oath, well, Domeric was now committed. And he knew that his son had different views on the future of House Bolton than he had. Did that matter? Should it matter? There was a weight of history and tradition and influence behind him, but on the other hand there was the very survival of House Bolton at stake. And the other threat as well. I am. For an instant he thought that he could hear a howl outside the walls of the Solar and he wondered if the direwolf had uttered it. Lord Stark smiled briefly and then leant back in his chair for a moment, before standing and pouring wine for them both. Then we are agreed. They clanked goblets and then he drank politely. He seemed to be on surer ground again and he was glad that sweat wasn't roiling down his face, because when Ned Stark had stood, then for a moment his face had been in shadow, and red fire had blazed for an instant in his eyes. The old gods were here. Here in this very room. We need the North to be united, Ned Stark said quietly after drinking some of his own wine. Especially as the others have returned. Roose muttered, shivering a little. What is the latest news? And how did you hear of it? Ned Stark paused and seemed to think very deeply for a moment. It's a long story, he muttered after a moment. But to cut a part of it short, nay. First I must tell you something. I saw you staring at the doorway over there. It leads to a room that my ancestors built. A place that held records and artifacts from the days of the first men. He coughed a little. There is a similar room in the Dread Fort, he confessed. Filled with things that I don't understand. My father never told me about the room. Ned Stark said the words with a certain amount of gritted teeth and he stared at him as a consequence. He didn't. Oh, he told Brandon, on his coming of age, or so we think. But I came of age in the Vale, at the Eyrie. And then. Your father and brother died, Roose breathed. Murdered by the Mad King. He felt paler than he had ever felt in his life, as shock took over. Oh, by the old gods. Damn that madman. Damn him to the lowest hell that existed. Then you knew nothing. About what to look for. Nothing. But. I had had a warning. From the old gods themselves. The others awaken. I have seen their home, in a vision. Great John Umber brought the Hearthstone to Winterfell. And that allowed me to send out the call. He nodded, remembering the moment that he had heard it. The shock of it. Oh, the shock. He'd almost thrown up. And the impact on his retainers, well, the call had been heard in the Dread Fort. But, the old gods. Domeric's letter. Oh, why had he not believed it more? Was his pride such a burden? We heard in the Dread Fort. What do you plan to do? Ned Stark sighed. A good question. The call seems to have been heard in many places. Volunteers have been flocking to the wall to help the Night's Watch. But it will take more than that. Far more. Then he gestured at the map on one wall. You have a mind for strategy, Roose. Come and give me your thoughts at what the map says. He strode over at Ned Stark's side and then stared at the map. Wait. What are all those settlements north of the wall? Wilderling villages and settlements, the reply came. More than we ever thought, or feared. He swallowed some more wine in what he hoped was a nonchalant manner. Ah. Yes. A few weeks ago Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, sat in here and told me that if needed he could call upon a force of 100,000 wildlings. The number rang through his head a few times as he desperately forced his mind to get back up to speed following its moment of paralysis. 100,000. I take it that Rayder was here because the wildlings are moving south. Being forced to. By the others. He looked at the settlements and came to an obvious conclusion. Then I hope that your plan involves letting them through the wall and into the gift and new gift. Because that's the only possible option open to you that makes the least bit of sense. Lord Stark nodded grimly. That number of men and women, and the others that must be there to support them, means there is no other way. If the others sweep south, transforming dead wildlings into whites, well, then the Night's Watch will be overwhelmed. The wall will fall. And we will be fighting for our very lives against the dead. Roose nodded. Does the king know yet? I think he suspects. I think that he heard the call, in a way. He wrote from Storm's End and then Dragonstone, saying that he had found the ancestral sword of the Durandons. Leastways, I intend to meet him soon, perhaps at Moat Cailin. Howland Reed is here at the moment, and he said that he had started to rebuild parts of it. People to the south are restless. Even the Ironborn have started to fight each other over who heard the call. But first I intend to go to Castle Black and talk to Jeor Mormont. The wildlings must be allowed safe passage south of the wall. He will not like it. Nor the Umbers or the Karstarks. No one will. Great John Umber is here still and has been persuaded. The Karstarks, again, will be persuaded. The same with the other houses. The numbers speak the truth. The dead march on the wall. Roose breathed as he looked back at the map. They do. He took another gulp of wine. Then he committed himself. House Bolton will back you to the bitter end, Lord Stark. As you said, the dead march. The living must fight them. And the North must be united. You are the Stark in Winterfell. Lead us. Brynden. The fisherfolk of the village had a ship that was big enough to take 2 horses and their riders. He looked a little askance at that, but then shrugged when Robb Returns had just grinned at him and mentioned that the Isle of Faces had many friends. Secret friends. He looked at the horizon to the northeast and sighed. Are you prepared for your enemies, if they come? We are. A lot of people hunt near here. A handful of men with bows can cause carnage if you're not expecting it. He eyed the man carefully. A handful. The grin came again. Well, perhaps more than that. As I said, the Isles of Faces has many friends. Some are secret, some are not. Now, let's get you on your way. He nodded and then paused. Robb, I meant what I said. King Robert gave me permission to knight you. He did not rescind that, he just told me to knight you when I saw you next. If it will help. The other man went pale for a moment, before shaking his head. When you return perhaps. Not yet. The ones who come, well, they will not listen to any kind of knight. I think that it would take the intervention of the warrior himself, and even then it might be nip and tuck. Later then he said, hoping that this would not be the last time that he met the man, alive at least. There was a fight coming, he could almost smell it in the air and he was sorry that he could not be there for it. Robb insisted on them leaving at once however. Stay alive Robb. The world needs stubborn old bastards like you. And you, Sir Brynden. I hope you find what you're looking for on the Isle of Faces. So do I, given that I have no bloody idea what I'm doing here. Eat the paste. And with that enigmatic statement Robb went striding off, to chastise a young man who seemed to be holding his sword like a bloody stick. Brindon jumped over the side of the ship, assessed the wind, nodded approvingly at the way that the horses had been guided into the belly of the ship, grinned tightly and then tied his long hair back in a queue. Let's be about it then. The captain seemed to know his business, because he eased the ship away from the jetty with little enough assistance from anything other than the wind and then sent the vessel heading straight west across the lake. The wind was set fair, and as the boat surged across the water he found himself remembering the last time he'd seen the lake this close. It had been after the Trident, a day of blood and triumph. Brian of Tarth appeared at his shoulder. She seemed somber. What do you think we'll find there? I don't know, he said after a long moment of deep thought. I just know that I have to go there. You? The same, she said tersely, before sitting down on a stanchion and gripping a rope tightly. Why here and not the north? We'll soon find out. The Isle of Faces was drawing closer and closer, and as they approached he could see the weirwood trees ahead of them. They docked in a little cove, where what looked like an ancient stone jetty jutted out from the shore. Ancient it may have been, but it looked well maintained, and he wondered who had been doing the maintaining. The fisherfolk got the horses ashore with little fuss or bother, and when Brindon asked how they could send them a signal when they wanted passage, the captain of the ship shrugged. We'll know, he replied. We'll know. And then he had reset his sails a little and then taken his ship off to the southwest, ready to beat up before the wind back to the village. As they led their horses up the worn stone path from the jetty that disappeared between the trees, they both fell silent. This was a place for quiet. The white trunks of the trees and the red leaves made the place unlike any other he had ever seen. There was no sound in the trees, other than the noise of leaves rustling in the wind, with the occasional movement as a squirrel leapt from branch to branch. The air felt close, and he had the oddest feeling that he was not merely being watched, but closely inspected. By what though? The answer, he discovered, was by whom. Brian spotted him first and then nudged him in the ribs. He looked to one side and then saw the man. He was old, very old, and he was sitting at the base of one of the trees that lined the path. He was also wearing a green cloak, green breeches, a green tunic and large black boots. Something appeared to be attached to the hood of his cloak, but he couldn't quite work out what. He was also either asleep or dead, and it was hard to tell which. Brindon swapped a confused glance with Brian. Then he finally coughed slightly. This made the eyes of the old man flicker open. He looked around at the path and then he noticed the two figures. Ah, he said in a wheezy voice that grew in power as he spoke. You're here. About time. I was just resting my eyes. Then he turned to look at the tree and frown. It's true. I wasn't asleep. Well, not all the way. Brindon swapped an uneasy glance with Brian. The old man did not seem entirely in his right mind, but he made an effort anyway. Good sir, I am. You are Sir Brindon Tully, also known as the Blackfish. And you are Brian of Tarth. Welcome both. Your arrival was foreseen. The old man stood up and then smiled toothily at them. I am Talard, son of Rukan. The old gods have remade the game board and the pieces are moving. Good. You have a lot to do. He stared at the man. Are you the reason why we were called here? Why we felt this pull? Pull. The old man seemed to consider this. Nay, I did not send out the call. The Stark in Winterfell did so, and it was right that he did. The others come. There is much that needs to be made right. You and your wife are a part of it. Brian turned pink with embarrassment and he sighed. We travel the road together. We are not married. What? The old man scowled at the tree again and then sighed. Oh, stop laughing. Bloody tenses. He turned back to them. Your pardon. You'll learn, soon enough. Follow. And with that he led the way up the path. He swapped another confused look with Brian, who shrugged, and then followed the old man, who was tugging at his cloak a little, before pulling his hood up onto his head. It had antlers attached to it and the pieces finally clicked together in Brindon's head. You are a green man then? I am. I thought that you had all long since passed from this world. The path crested a slight ridge and then went down, giving an excellent view of a clearing within the forest. There was a long building there, made of well-crafted timbers of weirwood, which looked ancient. Men and women were carrying out various activities around it. You thought that, did you? The old man said with a slightly unnerving grin. Well now, you were very wrong. Welcome to the Green Hall. Welcome to the old heart of the lands of the first men. The old gods have you in the palm of their hand now. As I said, the others come. The Stark has called for aid. And you. You are needed. But for other reasons. Robert. He glared at Pycelle, who looked oddly calm. Say that again, Grand Maester. The old man spread his hands. I cannot predict when Lord Arryn will awake your grace. Why not? I thought you said that he'd live from the dagger wounds. The wounds in Lord Arryn's side are healing nicely, your grace, with no putrefaction. Lady Arryn's vicious attack did not penetrate his ribs. However, it is the blow to the head that I am most concerned about. She seems to have kicked him several times there. And as you yourself know, your grace, head injuries can be unpredictable. I believe that two names in particular will remind you of this. Lord Haes Tamber and Sir Oris Embel. Ah. Robert paused and pulled a face. Yes, he remembered them both. They had both taken blows to the head at the Trident. Tamber had fallen into a deep sleep for 14 days and then woken up at King's Landing, scaring the life out of him when he had reeled into the throne room, half-dressed and shouting orders, convinced that he was still in battle. As for Embel, he had apparently shaken off the blow but then dropped dead in mid-song at the feast after the battle, with blood gushing from his nose and ears. Ah, he said tiredly. So we have to wait, in other words. Yes, your grace, I fear so. However, the fact that Lord Arryn has been asleep this long is perhaps a good thing. I simply cannot tell how long his sleep will go on for. Is his skull intact? Pycelle smiled slightly. It is, your grace. It's the second thing I ascertained after his other injuries. Robert absorbed that and then nodded. Very well. Thank you, Grand Maester. The old man shuffled out, and as he went Robert eyed his back carefully. There were times when Pycelle seemed to be more than he appeared. Odd, that. It was worth keeping an eye on the man. He turned back to the door to the room where Jon Arryn lay sleeping, and then he looked at the man standing guard there. He knew the signs of exhaustion. The man was pale and wan, almost shaking on his feet with fatigue. He sighed and took a step closer to the man, as he searched his mind for his name. Quill, isn't it? The Valiman nodded choppily and then seemed to recall who he was talking to and bowed. Yes, your grace. How long have you been standing guard? Some time, your grace. Can't remember how long. I'm not surprised. When did you last eat? Drink. Sleep. At home, some bread and ham not too long ago, and some small beer. Slept. His eyes flickered from side to side in thought. If you can't recall when you last slept, then you need to sleep, Robert said almost gently. See sense, man. If Jon Arryn woke up now, how much use would you be? I remember you from the Eyrie. You've done good service for him. See sense now and get some sleep. Quill seemed to almost quiver for a moment. But your grace, he said hoarsely, I need a guard to relieve me from the Tower of the Hand, and I cannot leave Lord Arryn unprotected and unattended. And Robert raised a hand and cut him off. Go and send for your relief. I shall stand guard. He stood in front of the door facing outwards, drew Stormbreaker and placed its point on the stone floor, his hands on its hilt to balance it. No one will pass me. You have my word. The Valiman stared at him for a long moment and then swept him a deep bow. Honor to serve your grace. Robert watched the man walk, almost stagger off with a slight grimace. Loyalty like that was without price. Unfortunately, it came at a different cost. Men like that would exhaust themselves without thinking. He shook his head and then fell into deep thought, only pausing to nod appreciatively when Sir Barristan Selmy, who had watched the whole thing, joined him at the door, sword in hand. If your grace will permit me to join you. Of course, Sir Barristan. As it happened, they didn't have to wait too long before three men in Arryn colours, all of whom he'd seen before, strode quickly in and then all knelt before him. Rise, he rumbled. Guard this room. Guard Lord Arryn. Aye, your grace, they all but chorused. We will. He nodded fiercely at them, sheathed Stormbreaker and then strode off. As he strode he came to the conclusion that he'd been fumbling towards for several days and sighed, before hailing a passing messenger. "Send word to my brothers at once that I need to meet with them in my antechamber." They'd know where he meant, not his actual antechamber, but a place just off it, a small and easily secured room that had few places for eavesdroppers to listen in. Sabaristan Selmy guarded the one door into the place, and there Robert waited, his mind more at peace now than it had been for days. Oddly enough his brothers arrived almost together, both looking grimly curious, and when he saw their faces he smiled and shook his head. "Jonarin lives. He sleeps and Pycelle is unsure when he'll wake again, but he's alive."